Well, the nature of the individual would be under character or ethos.
Yes.
There is a nature of this, I guess at the, what would you say, the species level or something under physis.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then there is the culture, which is the way in which some beings choose to organize their living. I'm not sure what besides human beings have culture, but you know, there's some, I think. But
Yeah. And there, you know, it's like each of these things has, each of these realms you're talking about has its own, it has layers. So, you know, the cosmos is the realm of physis, and it is driven by a logos that is not directly accessible to us, but is authoritative and defines that nature in its complicated dialectical Heraclitean way. And then likewise, when we move into these more human realms, the realm of, you know, humans en masse as a group, there is culture that has its own natural laws, but above that, we get something else, a third layer. You know, we've got the natural laws of culture, the culture itself, and then what we think the culture is or should be, which is our nomos, the rules that we lay down in imitation of the logos, saying, you know, this is how we're going to organize ourselves. That's our noetic idea of what our culture is. But beneath the culture, there is some kind of logos to it, or a character to it, an ethos to it, that we may or may not fully understand and may or may not have fully captured in our nomos, our attempts to, you know, to describe it or lay down the law. And from that, one can look back at physis and see the same thing is going on. We've got the bottom layer of the logos, it generates the physis, but above that is what we think the world is, the nature as we imagine it to be, which is a different thing from what it actually is. And it's also different from the laws, the true laws of nature, the logos, because we don't have direct access to those. It's a noetic invention where we attempt to model the world, just like with nomos, we attempt to model our culture. Sharon, go ahead.
Just have a quick question for Donald. Donald, are you on the fourth paragraph at the very bottom, where it says the actual logic and instrumentalities of nature are subtle? Its principles never perfectly obvious. Physis, philia, I don't know that last word, said Heraclitus, nature loves to hide, just as humans love to hide their eyes. Is that where you are, Donald? No. I'm trying to get
I just was reading something and I had not thought much about why did Kenneth say intrinsic truth,
Yes,
rather than just truth or extrinsic truth,
right,
or whatever, you know.
Right.
And so I reflected back to our previous discussions on truth as this harmony between thinking and being. Now, thinking is this noetic realm that you're talking about that creates and is most often wrong, or at least incomplete.
Right.
It is the source of our delusion.
Yes.
But nature isn't.
Okay.
But nature hides, as Heraclitus said.
Yes.
Loves to hide itself. I think in one of my seminars, we just spent weeks on what could this possibly mean. That's one of the most enigmatic and most discussed things out of pre-Socratic philosophy from Heraclitus.
Yes. Physis, which at this point we know what it's referring to more or less in this course.
Physis. How's this word spelled?
Physis.
SIS.
All right. Okay.
Physis.
sort of transliterated.
Like physics. Yeah, it's actually what? Phi upsilon sigma iota
Yeah.
sigma.
Yeah,
Physis philae, that's the loving part.
right.
It doesn't just hide. This is what Donald's alluding to. What it is very strange that he chooses that Heraclitus, who is so careful with his words, chooses philae, loves. Nature loves an encryptisthai, to hide. Nature loves to hide. It's its natural idiom. It is part of its core character that the logos that generates the nature that we see is hidden from us and has to be searched for, and that our search is imperfect because of the nature of the way we think about the world and imagine it, and thus we miss a lot. This is his core statement on human epistemology, that you have to go into it motivated to dig, to really search, but you also have to go into it with a perpetual humility, understanding that any model of the world that we construct will always be inadequate because the full scope of the laws of nature are hidden from us, because that's nature's natural idiom. So this is part of what Donald's alluding to with his triangle.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I wanted to know. I needed a text reference. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, there's physis, and below physis there's logos, and above physis there is our models of physis, which are inadequate. And then when it comes to culture, we have our own culture we have culture in the center, and below that is the ethos of the culture, the culture's logos, the culture's natural laws. And then above that is the nomos, which is our attempt to legislate or describe our culture, which again is a noetic construct rather than the thing itself. Part of what's fascinating about the modern world is that, being ultra Apollonians, we equate the laws that we have passed with the laws of the culture itself. There's some, if you really dig and you really get into legal studies, they will eventually admit that there is such a thing as customary law or tradition or something which carries some weight in certain circumstances. But in American law, it carries less weight than it does in European law. Like in Europe, they recognize that, there is this great body of practices that have allowed Europe to keep going that the law only imperfectly reflects. But in American legal practice, we sort of barely acknowledge that that's true. We sort of come closer to equating our nomos with whatever the actual laws of the culture are that make it functional. It's because as Apollonians, we're not willing to fully admit that the imperfections of our description of nature.
I suppose in the legal thing, you strike the contrast between the subjective and the objective.
Yes.
Very strongly. It's like, objectively, what is murder?
Mm-hmm.
Subjectively, you can say it's forms by intent, and that tends to work very well.
Yes.
But objectively, could you actually get out your measuring tape and measure the universe and number crunch down, this was a murder?
Right.
Certainty.
Yeah, this is where all the struggles come down, right? And as Apollonians, we really want it to be the case that all things that matter are measurable, like you're describing. They can all be turned into a simple equation or formula. And so the third point of Donald's triangle, ethos, in this case, he's talking about an individual's character. So just like the culture, has a character, and then it has the nomos that tries to describe it. The individual has their own character, which is their internal laws of nature that drive them, which Heraclitus calls the ethos when he says, I guess I'll put that in here too. Ethos anthropoi daimon. He's saying, we translate that as character is fate. And what he's trying to say is, whatever the laws of nature are inside of you that generate, your identity as a person, they act upon you like a god. They have authority over you, and they nudge you and ultimately determine what's going to happen in your life. So somewhere above character, we then have our self-identity, our understanding of who we think we are as a person. And just like all the other third layer constructs, it's a noetic construct, but it also has a strong gnostic flavor because it's impossible for us not to experience ourselves. Our gnosis is heavily involved with who we think we are. So there is a blending of gnosis and noesis. And the noesis side isn't just what we think about ourselves, but what we've been taught to think about ourselves by our culture. And so partially it's our own ideas about who we think we are. Partially it's our experiences of having been who we've been. And then partially it's what our culture, especially in the case of ours and our Apollonian culture, has taught us we ought to model ourselves as, regardless of whether or not that's who we really are. So, for example, if we believe that all people are equal, Jeffrey Dahmer and Martin Luther King exactly the same, the way that we promise in our Apollonian world, and that you're not supposed to judge, that everybody's just supposed to be treated as identical, then we're going to be inclined to read ourselves differently than if we grow up in an agonistic culture that tells us that we have an obligation to struggle to become better. Like if we read Martin Luther King's speeches carefully, he doesn't tell us not to judge. He tells us not to judge by the color of our skin. He tells us to judge by the content of our character. And which is a very Greek perspective. He's saying we should be working to cultivate our character to become a better person, to live out the practice of love and the other virtues, and strive to do better tomorrow than we did yesterday. And in so doing, if we buy into that classical perspective, it tells us that our model for ourselves is not only allowed to, but must include judgment calls about ourselves, where we try to size up, how did we do? Did we do well? Did we not do well? But if instead of that, we fully accept modernism's premise that there's no such thing as better or worse, that we're all just little biological machines, then we will let that slide, and our relationship to ourselves becomes slack. We stop cultivating, and we just say whatever is, and there's nothing better or worse than anything else. So there's a lot of power in Donald's triangle here, and I'm going to try to diagram it out. I thank you for bringing that up, Donald. So Phil, you got your hand up, and then we'll go to the text.
Yeah, actually what I gotta say really is related to what Donald just said.
Yeah.
But I am going to refer to the text, but I'm not sure whether I'm in the right section, but I think this is at the fifth to the last paragraph.
Yeah.
Of section A. It begins in nature.
Yes.
In nature, as the order generated in evolutionary beings, two concepts are ruled out as unthinkable. I could go on, but I'm going to stop from there because, I thought about that quite a bit, about the word unthinkable. I agree and disagree with it. And the reason is that it has something to do with what Donald said about, the truth as in nature and the truth that's within ourselves and culture.
Yeah.
And I thought of modern art, and I'm thinking especially of James Joyce. And I don't know that much about James Joyce, but James Joyce writes this thing in a completely convoluted
Yes.
order, right?
Yes.
It would begin in the middle.
Right. Like
Then
life.
he would go, then he would jump around, jump around, jump around. And then finally at the end, he would be at the beginning.
Uh-huh.
So seems like he is trying to think the unthinkable in a cultural sense of the measured time, and in this case, the narrative structure, right? So you're thrown into this thing, and
Yeah.
which is kind of like life. You're thrown into the middle,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't know what is what, and you slowly begin to come to understand, oh, there are other things, the relationships, and you have to go out and sort of like gather together and find these relationships,
Mm-hmm.
because he constructed the narrative.
Yes.
Of course, the parents is giving you the narrative, but nonetheless, you also have to find it yourself. And I think that means you're thrown into, well, at the middle. Well, not maybe I shouldn't say the middle. Somewhere when there already is.
Yeah.
Rather than like out of ex nihilo.
Right.
And I am now currently in two seminars with Heidegger. One is Heidegger in art. And this guy, we had the first meeting. It was very interesting. I liked it a lot because as artists, I understood that part pretty well. And he set a meeting for, like 2 weeks later, which would be something like the 31st. Then he switched it to the 14th, and then he switched it again to the April 30th, and then he switched it back to 24th. That is really confusing, right?
Yes.
So I wrote to my friend, I said, do you know what the thing is? Because and this is what I wrote. I said, maybe the organizer is trying to represent a form of finding the clearing, which is, of course, important to Heidegger. When time is not on a moving pointer of a scale of measurements. So time is, in a sense, embodied in yourself, and you're trying to find out exactly what time is this going to happen, right? And my friend wrote back something I think that's even more interesting. He says, I believe he wants us to understand the retaining that awaits. What's the sort of interesting, right?
Yes.
And 2 days ago, on Saturday, we went Heidegger on Being in Time. And we were discussing the whole idea of the waiting, right? What is that? Is that the authentic concept of time, or is that the inauthentic concept of time, right? You're waiting, you're waiting, you're waiting. And so, and then we talked about, of course, Heraclitus' metaphor about the sun rising, right? From the dark, because we weren't talking about the part that the sun was disappearing, submerging, but arising. And so many of the people thought about, the dark was you don't know anything, and then suddenly the sun arises. And this really refers to Plato's cave. You walk out and suddenly you see, oh, this is what it is. And I objected. I objected to that interpretation, that it was available to everybody. And I say, when I was younger, I loved to drive long distances in the dark because there was so many more possibilities. There was mystery and everything. And, and then what happened is your mind is not at rest. It's not really awaiting. It's sort of thinking of the possibilities. And then when the sun arises, it collapses many of those possibilities into some actual possibilities, okay? And so I said, this is a continuum. You have to think about the relationship of the disappearing and the emerging. They are one and the same thing, you know? And so therefore, I think that's what the unthinkable might mean, is that we have forgotten to think about the hiddenness part of thinking, and only think about the thinking part of thinking. and I think art really captures that best, because art is always, in a sense, left it incomplete or somewhat half truth, so that it's still there remains the incompleteness, so that you could find out the clearing, or you could say they're waiting for the return of the understanding. and I think that's what Heraclitus tried to do. And, that's why I keep on arguing for, Artemis. Why did she hand it over to Apollo?
Yeah.
That was a big mistake, because you miss half of it. Well, at least half of it, a whole lot of it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Because the hiding part is part of what truth really is, and you have to include the hidden part, the disclosure part, the veiling part, and you have to await for the disclosure. I think that's why I objected. And I think if you were just merely waiting, then in a sense, you are living an inauthentic life, as if like, it will suddenly bump into you, and there you will know. And so I think you have to search for it.
Let's take this. I think what's going on in the text here is that he doesn't mean that the concepts are ruled out as unthinkable in an absolute way. Mm-hmm. He means for the classical Greeks, they're ruled out as unthinkable. That the Greek culture and worldview was structured in such a way that, because phusis and intrinsic truth, intrinsic validity were completely intertwined concepts, which I'm going to dig into in a moment. For that reason, these things were unthinkable to them. And part of the reason he picks these two things is that for us, these two things are not only thinkable, but are the normal way that we look at the world. And he's trying to set up a contrast between how different the classical Greek perspective is from the modernist perspective. So this is going to take a little while to unpack. So bear with me, and I'll take us to the text and walk us through what he's trying to show here, if you're game. Let me grab I'm going to back up just a little bit and grab a piece of text here. Here we go. This is where we want to start. The paragraph that begins, nature is understood in at least two profound senses, becoming and intrinsic validity. And of course, the importance of this is that this is the title of this subsection, nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. And then he says, which to the Greeks are equivocally the same. Now, that just sounds like gibberish if you really parse it from a modernist perspective. From a modernist perspective, becoming and validity have nothing, literally nothing to do with each other. They're completely orthogonal concepts, the way we see the world. Becoming we're not really comfortable with becoming to begin with. We because of the law of the excluded middle, and because of our love of noetic either or dichotomies, we sort of want things to either exist or not exist, and to be or not be. And mammals are over here and reptiles are over there, and there isn't going to be any muddying of the lines, because if there is, it messes with our categories, and our noesis loves categories. But as Hegel points out quite strongly in his body of work, the concept of being in and of itself doesn't actually make sense. It creates too large a chasm with not being. And you need the Heraclitean dialectic and the concept of transformation and mutation in order to explain where things come from. Whether we're talking about embryogenesis of a human being, whether we're talking about evolution of a species, everywhere we look, contradicting the modernist preference for either or, truth or falseness, we find that everything is in a state of becoming. And that was the Greeks' normal, comfortable relationship to nature. They didn't have this problem that we have, trying to somehow make becoming make sense in terms of an either or choice between is or not is. Now, that could be hard for us to believe because we have Parmenides and we have some sections of Plato that embrace Parmenides. And so it makes it, and so much of Parmenides and Plato is preserved, it makes it seem to us as though it must have been normal for the Greeks to be all over this concept of being is, and that existence could be one thing and non-existence another, and that there couldn't be becoming. We have quotes from Zeno, we have Zeno's paradox and all this. This stuff is heavily preserved in the body of classical literature we have left to us. Whereas more Heraclitean concepts that suggest that becoming is the normal state of things, most of that has been destroyed over the millennia. And so we get that problem of selective evidence, where we try to generalize about the Greeks based on what's left, as though it were a statistically average collection. And in so doing, we fail to take into account the medievalists' abhorrence of some concepts and attachment to others, which led them to destroy some classical works and preserve others. And so we have a strong representation from the Greeks who talk a lot about being is, and a poor representation from the classical Greeks who talked about becoming as normal. But part of our evidence that cuts through all that is the fact that the word for nature in Greek is not some kind of word that means is or existence or being. It is phusis, which means, as he describes here, it means becoming. So the everyday, ordinary way of thinking about nature was in terms of becoming. And that helps us to understand that what's been preserved for us is an abnormal selection. With Parmenides, we are not seeing a representation of the normal Greek perspective. We're seeing a distortion of it. We're seeing a radical thinker who is exploring one set of ideas that the later medievals found deeply appealing, and so they preserved that disproportionately. And we can infer from the fragments we have from Heraclitus, we can infer from plenty of other places as well, that there used to be an enormous body of literature in which phusis was understood as the normal state, that becoming was understood as the normal state, and that most of that literature is gone to. So we can reconstruct, if we do the work, what it was like before the medievalist distortion of the statistical selection of works that we have available. So that's why he can say that becoming was a core concept for the Greeks. And he makes that point here briefly. He and I've talked about it in more detail elsewhere. So that's one set of concepts. To a modern, validity has to do with logic. It doesn't have anything to do with things merely existing, because a modern believes in a meaningless cosmos. It's a great machine, or it's a pantry, or it's a toolbox, or it's a collection of resources. But whatever it is, it's something mechanical, right? It has no meaning of its own, and its absence of meaning permits us to do whatever we want with it. We can destroy it, we can create it, we can rearrange it, we can satisfy our noetic, egotistical will to change the world without concerning ourselves with any possible violation of what might be just or unjust, because we believe the world has no intrinsic meaning, it has no intrinsic justice, it has no intrinsic truth. We believe in an empty void, a nihilistic cosmos, waiting for us to, in a godlike fashion, grant it meaning through our intentions. This is the modernist. This is what pragmatism is, in a nutshell. Pragmatism is the belief that you don't have to worry your brain about complicated philosophical things. Just focus on accomplishing successfully what it is that you mean to do. What it is that you mean to do is the only source of meaning you need to concern yourself with, according to a modern. So we're willing to engage in logical, discussion and analysis because it's value neutral. We get to set what the propositions are. We get to then follow through the logical consequences of those. And then, we get to say, if something satisfies the rules of logic from those propositions that we've laid down, then it is valid, right? We've married ourselves to this linear Aristotelian schema. And, you know, the way we know is that's how we structured our laws, that's how we structured our economy, that's how we structure our voting systems. Everything is done algorithmically and not in terms of ultimate principles. So for us, these are two unrelated realms. The realm of things that exist, which we see as meaningless, waiting for us to put meaning on it, and the realm of the laws and rules by which we assign validity based on our noetic analysis of situations, i.e., the empty world out there, the matter waiting to be formed by our plans. Right? We basically are recapitulating the medieval creation myth, right? Of a God who existed before the universe. Because nothing already existed, he wasn't bound by the limitations of the hule or matter, the way that a carpenter is limited by what a wood will or won't do, or a mason is limited by what stone will or won't do. God had no such limitations. He was able to ex nihilo blast out a cosmos based as a perfect capturing of the form of his design, right? A void and a perfect embodiment of form. This is what's in Genesis, or at least this is what's in the medievalist interpretation of Genesis. Let's put it that way. This isn't about Christianity. This is about medievalism, right? So when we overthrew medievalism, moderns kept that relationship of form and matter as a binary either or opposition between a meaningless world waiting to be molded by human, in this case, because we overthrew God, as Nietzsche argues, by human intentions and plans. And thus it creates an enormous rift between these two things. And to us, unless we've gone through this analysis of our history and our culture and where it came from, we're barely aware the rift is even there. It feels so natural to think of the world this way, as waiting for us to give it meaning by our plans, that we don't even realize that's what we're doing. This is the water we swim in. And what he's doing is calling attention to it in precisely the way that not only highlights it, but then says, if you were an ancient Greek, you would completely reject that as insane, as literally making no sense. Because for the Greeks, validity comes from nature. It isn't something we impose from without. Phusis, the realm of becoming, is the realm that not only generates a tree or an apple for us to eat or the water for us to drink, it is also the realm that generates the meaning and validity of those things. They assess it by the fittedness. They say it is not an accident. It is not a meaningless mechanical coincidence that fish live in water and have gills that allow them to extract oxygen from water. This isn't just two machines that somebody threw together according to their clever design. It's not an accident that we have a taste for an apple, that we want to bite into it and eat it and throw the core away so that the seeds can replenish themselves in the earth and make a new apple tree, right? So there is a larger schema of meaning and relationships that we developed inside of. We, as to go back to what Phil said, find ourselves not at the beginning able to be the authors of all things, the way our ego and modernism teaches us to imagine the world, but rather we are like a character in a tragic story. We begin in media res. By the time we begin thinking and asking questions about what things mean, most of the reasons why things have happened have already occurred in the past and been set in motion. And we are captured in gigantic networks of meaning and dependency that we are blind to until we begin inspecting the world and investigating it properly. And so to the Greeks, this made it obvious that validity and meaning arise directly from this realm of becoming. It's obvious to them. And the modernist concept that those could be two unrelated things, and you could have one set of rules over here for what counts as valid and a whole separate set of rules over there for what actually exists, they would have seen that as schizoid. It's like, what's wrong with your brain that you've cleaved it down the middle and separated these things that need each other, that don't make any sense without each other. So he's going back to the title, right? Here in this middle paragraph, in this opening sentence of it, he's going back to the title and dragging it out and saying, why did I call it this? I called it this because if you want to understand the difference between the Greeks and the moderns, you can't do any better than to begin right here, where for them, validity and becoming are a whole. But for us, they are split into an either or dichotomy, which is why Kierkegaard called those two works either or. He's constantly exploring the schizoid splits in the modernist perspective. So, fuo, the verb fuo, to flow, to grow, to become, right? There's a reason why Heraclitus uses the river to say you can't step in the same river twice. It's not a distortion of Heraclitus. It's not a modernist misinterpretation. We're not doing injury to Heraclitus when we associate Heraclitus's river with the realm of the cosmos, phusis, becoming, because that's exactly what he meant. That's the fuo is flowing is right there in the verb, right? Because you can't step twice in the same river because other and still other waters are flowing. So he's, in his careful, tidy way, Heraclitus is drawing out metaphors that are actually a lot closer in Greek than they are in English, to say this is a realm of tidal mutation. This is an aquatic, watery, flowing, transformative realm. And we are in it and we are part of it. Everything is in it. This is the realm of life and death, where everything is perishable, where things are born, come into being, they flourish, they reach the crescendo, and then they fade and die away. And that's the normal state of things in this cosmos. It's not some kind of punishment for sin that we die. It is the normal state of things. It is some kind of validity. It is some kind of justice that we are born and die from a Greek perspective. If we are born, we have to die. It's otherwise, to escape dying, we would have had to give up being born. They're part of the same flowing mutative cycle. This is also here where he points out that our word for nature comes from the Latin natura, which comes from natus, meaning having been born. And part of what he's trying to show here is, as much as we are less like the Greeks and more like the Romans, we're still not even really quite like the Romans, because naming the realm of nature as being those things that have been born is still pretty closely related to the concept of becoming, right? We've moved from the progressive present tense to a past tense. So it creates more of a static sense. These things are more than they are becoming in the choice of verbs in Latin versus Greek. But the concept still captures some aspect of a life cycle of transformation. Whereas when we say nature, we mean it in an almost completely meaning evacuated way. Nature is thus, it's just a big circle that we draw and say, everything goes in here. Yeah, Donald, Max Planck, death is essential for change. Yes, right. And when you read Parmenides and you see his objections to becoming, you realize it's because he's offended by death. Parmenides understands that part of the process of transformation is giving up what you were. This is what Hegel gets at with his core explanation of the dialectic as the bud, the blossom, and the fruit. When he says the blossom is the negation of the bud, he's saying it is at the same time a continuation of the life of the bud, while also being the death of the bud. Because in order to survive, you don't get to be the bud anymore. You have to give up budness to become a blossom. And likewise, to become the fruit, you have to give up blossomness. Even though, again, it is the continuation, it's also the death. That life and death are not alternatives, one of which is good and the other of which is bad, with an absolute abyss of meaning between them that makes it very convenient for Aristotelian logic and either or discussion. It's not that at all to the Greeks or to anybody who subscribes to the dialectic like Hegel does. It is rather a Heraclitean paradox in which things that a noetic personality thinks are either true or false instead turn out to be true and false at the same time, depending on which angle you look at them from, because they are bigger and more profound and more dimensional than the linear categories that we like to reason with. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we're talking about the dichotomy between the world of man and the world of nature, or the world of physis.
Yes.
The other aspect in with the medieval minds was the world of supernature, that there was an upper world, a divine world above humanity. The intense feeling that somehow the world of man was separate from the world of nature arises due to humans assuming that they are self-conscious, and generally nature not being this. So this is in the medieval conception of the soul. In the medieval conception of the soul, animals have feelings, animals have thoughts, animals have a consciousness, but human beings are self-conscious. That is, they objectivize what in the animal is a subjective. In the animal, feelings are subjective. It's not going to question them. Whereas a human being will objectify their feelings as an entity separate from themselves, or thought is objectified, or even consciousness itself is objectified. You see that in the earlier medieval works of the church. Sometimes I get the feeling the Catholic Church philosophically began to decline in the Middle Ages for some reason. They were no longer thinking. They were giving up the art of thinking. So what is the world of supernature? Where does this come in?
So yeah, thank you for that, Stephen. So let's take both of those points and explore, just for the people who are on this call who haven't been on past calls, we can do a little sketching again of the full scope of what this book is about that we're going through. So part of it is, you talk about, it's as though the church sometime during the medieval era stops thinking. And that's a sketch of a profound truth. And the truth is that the early church had to think more creatively when it was the underdog trying to refute the arguments of the full flower of classical civilization. Because here are all of these, by the late classical era, we have this massive body of philosophical work critiquing nature, critiquing the divine, critiquing, human beings individually and en masse. And Christianity, as it was arising from its roots in Palestine to a larger movement, it had to account for all of that. It was challenged, and you got a lot of kind of top-notch theological and philosophical debate, discussion, agon, struggle with those works, right? Because they were the underdog. They had to account for those things. The Greeks believed that agon was core to the survival of a culture, that cultures flourished when there was some kind of struggle going on. They didn't necessarily mean, violence, although with their roots, they didn't exclude that either. But they meant, debate, dialogue, discussion, competition. And they thought that the worst thing that could happen for a city was for a winner to emerge. Because if there was a clear winner and everybody just settled into a hierarchy, the culture began to dissolve. It started to kind of devolve back into a simple hierarchical, this guy tells you what to do and let's all do it because he's the best. And for that reason, there was a practice from time to time of ejecting the winner. There are quotes from Heraclitus, who's furious at Ephesus because his best friend, who he considers the best of men, has been ejected by Ephesus. And he's got a few quotes railing against Ephesus and its corruption. But we know from other Greek writings that it was not an unusual practice if one clearly dominant person emerged for them to be ejected. And sometimes it was a tyrant but other times it was just somebody who was so much better than everybody around them. And the reason was they wanted to get back to a mode in which the rest of the city could engage in the struggle to do better. If you create too large a chasm between what's better and what's worse, then what's worse gives up trying to become better. What's the point? The chasm is too great. And for example, if you were to absolutize that chasm and say the better is just better in every way and is perfectly good and can't be met or exceeded, and the worse is just completely worthless and no good and absolutely depends upon the top to grant it beneficence, the Greeks were afraid of that kind of relationship as being the kind of relationship that would destroy the possibility of culture and innovation. It would encourage people to wallow in a childlike helplessness. You know, from this perspective, the worst thing that could happen to early Christianity was to win and to overthrow the classical era and usher in the medieval era. And now they're the top dog. And, you know, so who are they competing with now? Who are they arguing with? That they can't just, you know, burn at the stake or stab or exile, but they have to actually argue with. The answer is no one. During the medieval epoch, they may, you know, they were able to institute dogma and to tell people you all have to believe what the dogma is, and if you don't, you know, we've got soldiers for that, we've got inquisitors for that. Our whole, you know, we've got a lock on philosophy. The moment you get into that model, it starts to create problems, and the problems are internal because now you're no longer struggling to creatively account for things that are beyond your reach. So that would be a Nietzschean, Heraclitean assessment, Stephen, of that question of what happened. You can say the Black Death was part of it, but and you know, it certainly was, but a big part of it was just victory, which moderns crave as being all good, as opposed to defeat, which we are desperate to avoid as being all bad. Victory, we think, will give us all good things. We want to be the winners. We don't understand that everything is a contradiction and a paradox. And if you win, the question you have to ask yourself is, what have I lost? And to the Greeks, what you've lost is that drive to struggle, to overcome somebody who's better than you, but within reach, if you just exert yourself. And so it's a disaster in some way for each epoch. By the time, you know, when it wins its revolution, by the time it reaches the middle of its epoch and it's now secure in its holding over its world, it's a disaster because its creative powers begin to lapse. It's no longer being challenged the right way. The other question you asked, Stephen, about this was about what is the realm of the divine. And for those who haven't been in this before, this book is called Millennium Microcosm. It's by philosopher Kenneth Smith, and it is a book in which he is attempting to help us understand our own epoch by comparing and contrasting it with two previous epochs of European history, the medieval and the ancient. And in each case, what he's trying to teach us to do is not to see them the way a modern might like to see them or prefer to see them, but instead to see them in their own terms, to understand how an ancient saw the world in ways that are different from how a modern sees the world, and to learn how to put on and take off that set of lenses so that we too can learn to look at the world the way an ancient Greek might see the world, and then to shift back to how a modern would. Because the contrast between the two is, once we understand it, is really quite jarring. And we begin to understand the aspects of the modernist worldview that are not, in fact, normal or natural, but are actually distinctive peculiarities of our epoch. He does the same with the medieval. We're gonna learn how to see the world from a medieval perspective, and we're gonna see how and why that's different from the ancient perspective, and how and why that's different from the modernist perspective. And as we get able to shift back and forth between these lens systems, it's going to really help bring the modern epoch into focus. The water we swim in will stop being invisible to us, and we'll start to see the structure of it and the currents of it and the way that it shapes us. So one of the core conceptions in the distinction between these three epochs is three sources of meaning that all people have to account for. And one is the realm of nature, and one is the realm of the divine, and one is the realm of the human. And he says a shorthand way of distinguishing these three epochs from each other is in terms of the hierarchy among these three. So for a modern, well, let's start with the ancients. For the ancients, nature is the topmost realm of authority. There's nothing above nature. The Greeks believed even their gods were born and died, that nobody created the universe. There's a quote from Heraclitus that says the cosmos always was and always is. It's an ever living fire, kindling in measures and going out in measures. This is Heraclitus. And this is not an unusual perspective among the Greeks. They thought, you don't have to answer the question, who created the cosmos? That's nuts. Nobody could create the cosmos. The cosmos is here. The gods exist underneath as a second layer of authority, underneath the cosmos, underneath physis, underneath nature. They are meaning within the cosmos, not supernatural meaning. And that the concept of an ancient god is an attempt by human beings to anthropomorphize and name and characterize what are the parts of nature that have the most authority over human beings. That if we don't notice those and we don't pay attention to those and organize our lives around those, we're going to get crushed. So the Greeks were seafarers, so it's natural that Poseidon would be a god because, I mean, enormous numbers of Greeks went to the sea, and if they didn't respect the sea and think about the sea and what it was like and what it wanted and what its hazards were, then, you know, they were going to fail. So you could see why Poseidon would be a deity in this sense. They don't mean a deity in the way that, and I'll come to you in a sec, Donna, I didn't mean to run you out of your question. So they didn't mean a deity in the way that we think of a deity. They meant a deity in a Greek way, which is what is one of the main powers in life. It's why Aphrodite is side by side with Poseidon as an authority, because beauty and attraction can sway most people. Most people, you know, however sane and sober and together they may think they are, there's something that can attract them that can throw them off course. We have this within us that responds to beauty and attraction. And therefore, by the Greek definition, that makes beauty and attraction a divinity over us that we have to watch out for and respect. And then they believed that the human was under that, right? So the hierarchy was first nature, then the gods, then the human. Any human law was subject to two higher authorities above it that it had to harmonize with in order to be worthwhile. The medieval world was a revolution against that. They took the thing that the ancient world loved more than anything and put it at the bottom. They said, oh no, nature's not the greatest source of meaning. Nature is completely without meaning at all. Nature is of no authority. Only God, and there's only one, is the source of meaning. And he's the source of all meaning. He could have made nature any way he wanted to, or he could have made it completely differently. It's entirely his whim, his choice. And there's an enormous chasm between God and man, but man at least has the spark of divinity, the grace given by God that allows us to rule over nature and to be custodians over it. So it inverted these relationships and said the primary source of meaning is God, the second in a monotheistic form. The secondary source of meaning is man as agents of God, and then the bottommost and really meaningless layer is nature in this conception. When the modernist world overthrew the medieval world, we overthrew God, just like Nietzsche accuses us of, and we put God at the bottom. But we kept the evacuation of meaning that the medievals had applied to their definition of nature. And so without a meaningful God to give human beings meaning, the new hierarchy in the modernist world is, on top is man, who has no meaning at all. He can do really whatever he wants, it doesn't matter. So we might as well get together and lobby and have parliaments and decide together what it is we want to do, and then we should do that. And below us is nature, which has almost no meaning. It is really no source of authority over us. It's entirely subject to us. Once we learn its laws and its mechanisms, it's just a great machine and a larder and a toolkit. And once we figure out how to make it work, it must be our slave. It must serve us absolutely, and we don't have to do anything that it says. We just have to, it has to do what we say. And that's the relationship between man and nature in the modernist conception. And below that is God, which we treat as a hobby. You can pick whatever church you want. Feel free to enjoy going to church just like you might enjoy skipping rope or drawing things or growing roses. It's treated as just something you might feel like doing, of literally no authority at all. And you see this in the way that we relate the three to each other. We explain nature without any reference to God, which is a counter-medieval thing to do. So, is nature the source of ultimate meaning? That's the classical world. Is God the source of ultimate meaning? That's the medieval world. Is man the source of ultimate meaning? That's the modern world. So this is what these different epochs have done with their conceptions of these things. And what he's going to do in this book is explore the consequences, the philosophical, axiological, ethical, epistemological consequences of these inversions. And all this is built on a Hegelian dialectic. Phil, are you there? You got your hand up, but I think you might have stepped away for a sec. Okay. Donna, you had your hand up for a while. You have a question you want to ask?
Yeah, it really is a segue. I appreciate what you're saying in the comparison of the various epochs, but I have to question if these various epochs and their kind of viewpoints can be represented in the ontological development of each individual. It's possible. And projecting that in history, I think there were people, all right, I observe this in the perception of my own life and the lives around me, that I see various viewpoints at times. I know you are clearly defining a modernist viewpoint, but I think there are times that we share those other viewpoints, and maybe this is part of what the author is leading us toward. Mm-hmm. But I think any person who is really viewing their own ontological development and they're aware experiences some of these viewpoints at times in their evolution, their personal evolution. That's what I see in my own life in any case, even though I appreciate your clearly defined and his clearly defined viewpoints. I see that personally, I think the waters are a bit muddied in this.
Let's explore that for a moment. Thank you, Donna. Mm-hmm. So, what you're alluding to is something Sharon brought up a few weeks ago, which is that this is not a noetic schema, right? Kenneth Smith is not a schematizing philosopher. He's not trying to make a theory of everything. He's an existentialist philosopher. So his focus is on paying attention to the way things are, and then you can work to model them, but you never want to confuse your model with reality. You always want to recognize that it's just a perspective. It's a perspective you want to learn how to put on and look through, but you also need to learn how to take it back off, right? And so part of what we're doing in this book is the exercise of learning to put on and take off at least these three different perspectives on the world. And that the practice of doing that will make it easier and easier for us to do that with other perspectives he didn't explore here, right? And a Hegelian take on this, which he's got some roots in Hegelianism, and Hegel's got some roots in the Greeks, and so does Kenneth, would be that, these epochs don't exist because Hegel says so, or Kenneth Smith says so, or Arendt, or anybody else. This is just what we seem to see when we look back at history. If we look closely at how these different epochs see the world, we can see that a Greek conceived of nature in a way that's very different from the way most of us today conceive of nature. And we can see Thomas Aquinas as a sample medieval conceived of nature very differently than either of those two did. That there are some reasonably alien viewpoints. And that's a curiosity because, as you point out, we're all human beings, we're all the same species, we're working with the same, biology in order to generate what apparently can be at times radically different modes of culture from each other. So how's that possible? Where does that come from? And to what extent, are these supposedly crisp lines between the epochs, where do they get muddied, and where do we start to see, the reality as being something in between? And Hegel and Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Smith, they would all agree that, yeah, we're not talking about somebody's abstract intellectual schema. We're talking about patterns of behavior that emerge from our basic human faculties. So we talk a lot in this course about gnosis and noesis, the two foundational metabolic faculties of the mind. I'll put them into the chat, which Hegel turned into a 3-faculty schema, which he called Begriff, which is naive gnosis, and then Verstand, which is naive noesis, and then Vernunft, which is mature gnosis plus noesis. And the thing about these is that gnosis and noesis are very different ways of experiencing and assessing the world. We're born with both of them, but they're kind of hostile to each other. So if we don't struggle against the tendency, we'll tend to slip into a caricature of one or the other, kind of character type based entirely on naive gnosis, what Hegel calls Begriff, or a character type based entirely on naive noesis, which he calls Verstand. Those are the easy paths to take. You've all seen the cartoon, the easy path downward has enormous crowds going to it, and the difficult path upward has only a few people going because people don't like to be uncomfortable. But to reconcile gnosis and noesis with each other and create the higher third faculty Hegel talks about is a deeply uncomfortable process. So most people, unless their culture encourages them otherwise, most people won't do it. They'll slip into one of these two. So the different epochs are the results of different tendencies towards people to slip into these patterns and generate a larger scale, pattern of culture. But none of these, they're not like prisons, right? They're not perfect categories. They're just strange attractors. They're just gravity wells. And you're always going to have a bell curve of distribution of different kinds of people's relationship to the norms of their times. Some people are going to be unhappy with their times and pride themselves on being outliers. I mean, I'm sure most of us on this call at one time or another have, had at least a moment of feeling like, yay, I'm a weirdo. I'm not like everybody else. And that's a good thing. And people who feel that way are the ones who are the most likely, even if they only feel it for a moment, they're the people who are the most likely to be atypical for their time and to therefore color outside the lines and do things that are not typical of their era. So earlier in this call, we talked about Parmenides. And we said Parmenides' concept of nature was antagonistic to Fusus. He didn't like the idea of becoming being the norm. And in so doing, he was an outlier for his era, right? Most ancient Greeks thought the norm was mutation and becoming. Parmenides didn't like that. And so he wrote his philosophical work attempting to argue that if the Greek verb to be implies existence in an absolute sense, then it must be the case that it was possible in nature for existence to happen without any becoming, just to be perfect and pure and always the same. He used a grammatical argument and then he slammed it onto the world and said, so the world must actually not have any change. It must actually be eternally existing things that are or are not. And from that you get Zeno's paradoxes and a whole bunch of follow-on philosophical lines. Well, he was an outlier, right? He was atypical for his era, just like the people on this call are atypical for our era in some ways, right? So I agree with you about the muddiness. None of this is intended to say, that there's some perfect schema here. This is just an attempt to describe and model what we see. And I'm going to take us to to the text again before I call on Phil, I think. So we started out with that sentence about nature understood in at least two senses, becoming and intrinsic validity, which to the Greeks are equivocally the same. And I took the time while saying that to point out that this is the central point of part A of this chapter, because he titled it based on this dichotomy, becoming and intrinsic validity. And he titled it that because this is one of the places where he can drive a wedge between our expectations and the truth. And the truth is, we expect, as moderns, unlike other epochs, as moderns, our relationship to history is very different. We see the past as justifying ourselves. We see the past as a primitive version of ourselves. The concept of primitive and advanced is very important to us. It's very important to us. We want to believe we're better than the people in the past because we are in the present. And that by being in the present, we want to believe we've been climbing a ladder, going up and up and up, from the muddy, mucky, messy forebears to the glorious, wonderful, godlike beings who are ourselves. And that, we are the pinnacle of evolution. We are the pinnacle of progress. From here, it can only get better from here as long as people do more of what we've been doing, because we're doing it right. We're the good ones. Progress, the great march of progress, and patting yourself on the head and using the past to denigrate and scapegoat and say, well, they were all bad and worse than us. This is, we might call it human nature, but it is absolutely not. You can read plenty of accounts of the medieval world and plenty of accounts of the ancient world that make it abundantly clear they did not see their past that way. We do. We see our past that way. So our inclination when we read that phusis is defined as becoming, when we read that some other term is defined as intrinsic validity, our tendency is to want to read them as meaning what we mean. They're either the same as us or worse than us, but they can't be better than us. They must be worse than us at all things, an inferior version. And it causes us to fail to interrogate these terms adequately. And so we fail to see that right here is one of the biggest differences between the ancient Greek world and the modern world. That for us, validity and existence are unrelated to each other. They're different realms. There's the realm of noetic logic and intellect, systematizing reason and rationality, which we see as the source of validity. And then on the other hand, there is the realm of existence, which we see as meaningless until people get together and decide what it means in a parliament or in a church or in the marketplace or whatever we think is the proper human organization for mediating the decisions about what things mean. And we don't understand that that diremption is part of the signature of the modern world. Any other epoch would look at us making that split and go, what? You are a very strange people that do this thing. To us, it can't be strange because it's normal. So he's making the point here. To the Greeks, those two realms were not two realms. They were one realm. These things were not split from each other. And the idea of splitting them, they would have thought was crazy. A couple more people here, and then I'll get to the sentence that follows. So Phil, go ahead. Oops. Sorry, Donald, I meant to do that for Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I really like the way you talk about, the classicals, the ancients, about becoming is being, because we do have an understanding about becoming. Becoming is the path to being, right?
Yes.
This is what we. However, having said that, and that's a very, very important distinction, and I want to underscore that. However, Aristotle understands this, but he has the telos. And in the telos, in a sense, becoming, even though it is being, it is moving to another transformation of being. Let's put it that way. And so if he talks about the acorn, in the process becoming the oak tree, there seems to be a kind of a kind of prejudice, a sort of like privileged position for the oak tree itself. It seems to talk about the high point in which it shows itself, and not about the dead tree. Now, there are cultures that venerate not just the becoming the great human being that we are, the great individual, but venerate the old, because they're past the curve, but they venerate that. There are even some cultures who, after somebody dies, they leave it in the living room for a while to be with the dead. And if you want to talk about it in that sense, in terms of culture, there's certainly an aspect, and I don't want to underscore too much of this aspect. The Egyptians, they really venerate death.
Yes.
I mean, so you talk about, what is it called? Reincarnation. That's about completing the cycle. So why is it that the Greeks, who understand this idea of becoming, sort of leave out, like I said, the night part of the becoming, because it is part of the becoming that repeats itself.
Yeah.
And venerate the high point when somebody is, let's say, 35, got all his makeup, he's grown into the man. The child is the child of the man. It doesn't say that the child is the child of the decrepit old age of the deaf person. So could you say something about that? Because that seems like kind of an important part, because the becoming is being. It's only being sort of halfway.
Yes. So, sure. Thank you. So a couple of things about that. One of them is that the Greeks were, as Phil is alluding to, they were very aware of death. Moderns often don't want to talk too much about death. We sort of want to postpone that discussion as long as possible. When people get to a certain age, they start worrying about tidying up their will. But a lot of moderns don't get around to that for decades because they don't want to think about it. The modern world is very interested in the time when we're useful, i.e. alive, and more importantly, not just alive, but able to be productive, i.e. to produce value for shareholders in our modern economy. The parts where we're not useful, we're pretty uncomfortable with. So like Phil points out, we sort of take the becoming and we compartmentalize it into an era that we call childhood. And we say, before you are legally an adult, there's some kind of that messy, horrible becoming stuff going on. And people seem to get upset when we exploit your children. So, okay, well, I guess we'll agree, for the sake of avoiding the torches and pitchforks, that we won't obviously exploit your children, although we will still exploit them as much as we can. But once you hit adulthood, now you exist to be exploited. You're now a modern citizen. You exist in a way that makes sense to the law. And so you are now actually in the modern epoch. Before that, you're in some kind of weird state, but now you're in the modern epoch. But then that only lasts till retirement, right? And then retirement is the point at which we say, well, now what are you? I mean, from a modernist perspective, you're not as useful anymore. So it's hard to say. The modern era starts to get dodgy about defining you as a modern citizen. Like, well, I suppose you can still vote, but you aren't earning money. Maybe we can raid your savings account. Let's see, we could make medical care really expensive. That's a way to make you useful, because now all those accounts that you've built up while during your productive era, we can drain them. And that's your value to society, is we can suck you dry until you're bankrupt around the time of your death. And if this sounds cynical, you just have to look at the structure of the law, especially the US healthcare system. And there is no question that it is designed to ensure that whatever assets you've built up during the useful part of your modernist existence are then rendered back down during the useless parts from the modernist perspective, when you're not laboring anymore. They want to get at what you've got. And even death is turned into a chance to sell some stuff. Right? We can sell a funeral, we can sell embalming services, we can sell coffins, there's going to be a lot of sales. There's a price tag associated with death because that's what grants it a value. under modernism. Until it reduces to numbers that can be accounted on a spreadsheet, it doesn't exist for a modern. We like money because money is math. In fact, it's arithmetic with some statistical math applied to the end of it if you get large enough numbers to work with. But generally speaking, this is how we do the foreground background selection of what we're going to abstract from the world and consider to be important. So enough. That's the modern take on death. The ancient take on death was that, at least by the time you get to the Greeks, I don't know how well the Egyptians fit this model. As you're saying, there's a discrepancy here. But by the time you get to the Greeks and the Romans, death is considered sacred because them's fighting words. You despoil somebody's tomb, you may have an entire tribe of people coming to kill you. And the Greeks therefore understood that if they were going to have a viable society, they had to draw a circle around the realm of death and say, this is going to be a protected space. This is going to be the realm of religion, not of politics, not of the economy, not of normal social life. There's going to be rites and rituals, and it's going to be set aside from life, right? So that the descendants and so that the ghosts are all satisfied and don't destabilize what we're trying to build. You understand what I mean? It's very antithetical to the way the Egyptians did it. It's very much in some ways it's the same, and in some ways it's the opposite. It has the sameness in that it's considered a sacred realm, but it's the opposite in that the point of life is life, and the point of death has been schismed off. Whereas among the Egyptians, the point of life was partly death. Right? It's why they were saving their money up in order to get mummified or have their own little tombs. As we now know, the workers who worked on the pyramids were not slaves. They were, advanced engineers who were very good at what they did, and they earned a living and they saved up their money so that they could get embalmed and their cats could get embalmed and they could have nice little tombs with engravings as well. Everybody was focused on that realm of death and making it nice. And in that way, they've got some similarity with the Greeks. But you're right that the Greeks have a very this-worldly, vitalist focus that is unusual. And the Romans have that too. That is very unusual compared to the Egyptians. A full accounting of that is going to take a much deeper dive than we've got time for today. But it's a very interesting question. I'm glad you brought it up. Donald, go ahead, and then we'll go back to the text.
Why don't you just go back to the text?
Because, Donald, you've been waiting to say what you have to say, and it's going to be good.
I was only going to say two things. For moderns, truth is sort of the construction of true statements or sentences or something.
Yes.
And I think for the Greeks, it would have been pointing at nature. It's hard to say. Aristotle invariably does this. Plato does it. When you look at their definitions of things and whatever, they try and get you to see something in the world. And the memorization of a true statement, orthodoxy, true, is generally considered of no value whatsoever. So there's a great deal around not just intrinsic truth, but truth for an ancient and for a modern. And two, wouldn't it have been really neat if Heraclitus had understood differential equations? Then given some initial set, we could have known about the past and future flow of this river he's so concerned about. Or as Zeno said, Heraclitus got it all wrong. You can't step into the same river once. There is no river.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, by the time we meet the Greeks, they are past their peak. Most of the great Greek writers that we think of are people who are writing well into the change from a mythos culture to a logos culture. And they are increasingly atypical people with atypical views of the world. And a modern has a tendency to read all of that and take it at face value and assume that these people are all representative, when in fact they're not. The arguments that are happening, you couldn't even have got a Parmenides out of Greek culture at an earlier stage because there was a greater homogeneity. They were more in tune with their sense of nature as becoming. By the time you get a weirdo who's saying, not only is nature not becoming, nothing ever really changes, that's all an illusion, and everything is actually static, and really there's only one thing, and it's a big unchanging thing, and that's just the way it is. That comes out of left field. That comes out of an enormous discontent with the culture. That is not a normal position. Even to a modern, Parmenides is so dry, he's difficult to describe. Parmenides' great statement, what he considered the peak of his philosophy was the dictum, being is, period. Being is. We thought that was the most profound thing you could ever say. And it's so dry and austere that that even though it's a very modernist concept, it's in terms so dry that even a modern can't quite choke it down. So, all right, so let's look at the next sentence in that same paragraph as up above. Where does he go after he defines nature and physis? He says, he then talks about this concept. Yes, one thing which is large and spherical, says Parmenides, because the sphere is the perfect shape. Oh, he's so noetic, he's so intellectual, and he's not recognizing how much he's egotistically imposing his model on the world. Anybody can look out the window and say, is there really only one large thing that's large and spherical? Or my mason bees large and spherical? How about that rosemary bush? None of it actually fits Parmenides' description, but he assures us, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? All right, so Kenneth Smith is saying, from the Greek perspective, all natural existence is pregnant with its other. Pregnant with its other. How do you explain the fact that everything is changing? Why? And when it changes, nevertheless, it doesn't change randomly, right? An apple tree doesn't open up a flower and then a television set blooms. That just never happens, ever, not even once. So the people who argue, if we admit that there's change, then it will unleash chaos upon the world, and we have to therefore disprove change in order to bring order to life, they're obviously full of it, because any of us can see that fruits bring forth according to their type. Animals bring forth according to their type. There is variation, an enormous amount of variation sometimes, but it's still according to the type that it is. Not the type as we define it, but according to some, we said nature loves to hide, right? Says Heraclitus, according to some hidden character within the thing. The thing contains the seeds of the future. And the seeds of the future it contains are of a couple of kinds. And one of them is it contains the seeds of, its offspring, should it have any, but it also contains the seeds of its future self. Who is it changing into is partially inside of itself. I mean, yes, in a mechanistic, entropic-driven world like moderns believe in, extrinsic forces are obviously preeminent. We believe that things change because we change them, or something bumps into them, or our toaster was working perfectly fine until that idiot knocked it off the shelf. And we believe extrinsic things drive change. But part of a living universe is the idea that things change themselves. Like we talked about last week, the realm of nature is a realm in which things create themselves. They don't need a creator to be there at every second molding and manipulating them. If Aquinas is right that we should study nature because nature is the signature of God and tells us about God. What we can find by studying nature, as I said last week, is that God doesn't create the way we create. We create with, big plans and designs in which we lay everything out and try to control all the variables, and then we make the thing from parts, and then it exists until entropy breaks it down. But that's not how God's creations work, according to the Greeks. And anybody who believes in a God who studies nature will see the same thing that they saw, which is things create themselves. The acorn makes the tree. The acorn, in some way that's different from the way that we know, the acorn knows what an oak tree should look like. And it's not going to Xerox out some plan and make it exactly happen, but instead it's going to, in symathesis, in a learning relationship with the world around it, sensing closely and responding to the world around it, it's going to develop itself in a oak-like way that will create an oak-like tree, even though no two oak trees will ever be the same. So it's pregnant with its other. The acorn isn't an oak tree, but it's pregnant with it. And the same is true of the adult oak tree, to go along with Phil with critiquing the modernist conception that the adult is the real form and the other thing is some sort of weird aberration that happens until you reach adulthood. Even the adult oak tree is constantly changing, constantly growing. It is in a symathesis relationship with nature, and it is continuing to create itself. And through the process of self-creation, it is othering itself, changing from one thing to another. And for us, as moderns, we struggle to find the words to say the sentences that I just said. I mean, Nora Bateson had to coin the term symathesis after a lifetime of work by her father, Gregory Benson, to try to understand how natural systems work, because we didn't have a word for it. The word system didn't work, the word ecosystem didn't work, the word, all of the words we have presuppose a mechanistic entropic world that is meaningless and that needs a creator or a designer or is just a machine doing what it does for no particular reason. We struggle against our language here, as Kenneth Smith warns us, because as moderns, everything about us, including our language, including the structure of our thoughts, has been molded in a modernistic way to see the world a certain way and to have a very hard time seeing it a different way. So it's hard for us to understand the extent to which this could not be true for the Greeks. For the Greeks, it would be easy to see the world as full of things that are creating themselves and sensing each other and harmonizing with each other. These don't require fancy words. These are the normal words of Greek and the normal thoughts that they use, that it just is obvious to them that this is going on. Every sentence they say seems to reinforce this concept of aliosis, which means othering, right? That everything is always othering itself at all times, mutatis mutandis. So his next phrase, I'll call on you in a second, Joseph. His next phrase here, incubating cryptic forms of future order, right? As moderns, we inherit the medieval prejudice that matter contains no meaning and form must be imposed extrinsically from without by a creator or a designer or by a human ego or system. So this entire concept that things are pregnant with their other and that they're incubating order, that order is immanental within, essential to matter, that matter is not a realm of chaos waiting for order to be applied to it. Matter is a realm of order that contains yet further order coiled up inside itself, waiting to express itself at all times. Phusis cryptisthai philae, cryptisthai, cryptic. He's saying cryptic here to allude back to cryptisthai. Nature loves to hide. So the future order is hidden inside of the things that exist now, because that's nature's natural idiom, to coil up the future order inside of the things that exist now. And that future order and orientation are presently unthinkable because you look at the acorn, and unless you have a long experience with acorns growing into oak trees, there's really nothing about it that suggests the shape of an oak tree. The transformations things go through can be even more profound than from a larva to a butterfly. You look at the one and you look at the other and you say, that really, that is going to turn into this? And nature's like, for starters, I'm just getting going here. You won't believe what we're going to turn this into. Some days these are all going to be some other kind of species entirely, given enough time. You just can't see it yet. There's layers of hiding and layers of order down there waiting to exist. So for this reason, he says and in here, he's just slapping Parmenides back and forth across the face with this next phrase. When he says, to exist, remember being is, we're talking about existence. To exist in nature is to be variable and subvertible in exactly the way that horrified Parmenides. We, as anybody who has grown old can tell you, we didn't start out like this. This is not the way, and this may not have been what we had in mind for ourselves. We are not entirely in control of our own destinies. Life is a weird mix of praxis where we get to act upon the world the way we intend, but also pathos, things that we must endure, that this is just the way it's going to be. We might like them, we might not like them, it doesn't matter. It's still a pathos because it is imposed upon us. And much of that imposition, it's not just from other people, it's not just from the laws of nature around us, but as Heraclitus says, there are also laws of nature within us. And those laws of nature are unfolding new shapes of us, whether we like it or not. That's all part of what it means to be alive. And thus, all that is natural changes. It falls prey to the fate of aliosis or othering. Joseph, go ahead.
So this is kind of actually blowing my mind a little bit, what you just said, even though I apologize that I'm late, because that there's actually order already within chaos is kind of like where we also, we have to bring, it's always like we have to extract order from the chaos. That's kind of what I've always thought. But one thing that is this, so is this the problem? You kind of answered my question. Is this the problems with systems thinking, essentially? Is that what you're getting to heart at? Like, and you said there's a distinction between, you said natural systems thinking versus systems thinking. And could you make that distinction for me? Because that's an important part. I know there's Christopher Alexander, and I still haven't read his book, so I apologize for that. But that's an important, this is an important concept for me in design thinking that I've been doing a little bit of reading about. The distinction between design through nature and a design through, I guess, a artificial system.
You got it.
Yeah, and that's an important thing, because I also, and I brought this up in the past sometimes, and I have this problem separating that from some of the economic, designs as well. Yeah. Because then you know that's a very difficult thing when you're talking about design think as well. How do you design? Are you designing an economic system? How do you design that within the constructs of nature? That's hard as well. I mean, but that's a whole nother separate subject. But I was just wondering if you could maybe just expand a little bit on the distinction between natural systems thinking and systems thinking.
That's a great idea. Let's do that.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joseph.
Thank you.
Okay, so chaos and order. You can see this in modernist obsessions with law and order. We believe that if we don't wield force to compel the chaotic matter of human beings in mass into an organized society, all chaos will break loose, and next thing you know, we'll be eating each other and hitting each other over the head with clubs and rocks. This is core to the concept of how the justice system of the modern epoch works. We believe that order and chaos are opposites, and that order is opposed systematically according to designs. We lay out a system of laws that say what is permitted, what is not permitted, and a system of punishments for the things that are not permitted. And the belief is that people are simple behaviorist machines. And if you apply the negative stimulus of the punishments, it will guide them towards the positive goal of the order that we wish to create. This is core to the concept of how a modern sees the world. And it's not just in the justice system. We internalize that. You know, when we're asleep and we dream, our brain makes connections between ideas, whether we like it or not, and tries to harmonize what's inside of us, because the realm inside of a human being is another realm of nature, like the one outside of it. And so it is trying to create harmony. It's trying to reuse materials and reconcile them with each other to create a whole. And so we apply metaphors from one part of life to another unconsciously, even when we never consciously would have done that. Even if we believe we didn't do it, even if we argue and our life depends on it, and we are as truthful as we can, and we argue to our dying breath, we never ever did that. We did it anyway, because our unconscious is busy making patterns without our permission. And among those patterns is this idea of the law of the excluded middle, binary thinking, true or false, yes or no, right or wrong, existence or non-existence, order or chaos. We internalize that from any number of cop shows, from any number of classroom systems of organization, from the way a job works and so forth. And we see the world itself as fundamentally being about order and chaos. This is why, in the absence of a God at the top of the modernist schema of meaning, having overthrown God, we are left with what we think is a meaningless cosmos. And because it is meaningless, who then is imposing order upon it? We have this medievalist conception of order, that it is forced upon us. And if nobody's forcing it, then it might not be happening at all. And if it doesn't happen, we believe that entropy will rule and the universe will fall apart. We believe in an entropic universe that is winding down, right? We see life as a weird, inexplicable thing that happens, but once you're here, you start winding back down again. And that part we feel like we understand because it fits our model of order and chaos, that whatever order was somehow put there to make you an adult, it begins unraveling and falling apart under the pressures of life. That's our model. That's how moderns see the world, whether they understand it or not. So for us, when we try to counteract that, we try to build societies, or we try to write computer programs, or anything that we're trying to do systematically, we think what we need is abstractions, facts, tests, logical syllogisms, and algorithms. And if we lay those out correctly, we will get a system of rewards and punishments that guides the chaos back towards the order that we want. And by guides, what we mean is forces, right? Because behind every law is a police officer with a bat and a gun. And we may not like to talk about that. We may find that the modern world feels nicer to us if we pretend that that's not what we mean when we pass a law. But the truth is, when we pass a law, we mean society's capacity to wield violence is now brought to bear on this problem, if necessary. Hopefully, most people will be scared by the law into complying without having to actually be hit with a bat. But if they don't, we all know if push comes to shove, if we're really queried about it and are forced to be honest, we all know that what's behind these laws is that we can force somebody. We believe in a coercive order. That's where we get order from. When you write a computer program, most programming languages are what's called imperative languages. Imperative as in the tense of language, which is to give a command. We believe we are commanding the computer to do things. We believe we have a coercive relationship with the computer. It is a slave to us. It is mere matter, and we supply the form in our algorithms and data dictionaries. And that form imposes order upon the chaos. All the computer has is the capacity for order, but it's waiting for us to order it, to tell it what to do. And this model is now how we conceive of our own minds. You can hardly read an explanation of the human brain without people saying that the brain is a computer, an organic computer. And so, and that society is educating us by feeding us data, and that it is teaching us algorithms so that we will properly comply with civilized society and civilized plans. So again, even in our relationships to ourselves, we see order as a mechanical, coercive thing applied from without in order to compel what would otherwise be chaotic and fall apart under the laws of entropy to somehow hold together for some time. I'm going to pause before I go any further because I see you got a question, and this is your show. So,
thank you for allowing. Now, so our minds aren't information processing, essentially machines. Right. So, and that's something that I've actually heard a lot of lately by AI enthusiasts.
Yes.
So essentially, that they're saying that that's all a human being is. So that would mean in certain things that there are limitations to probably what it could possibly do in the future, like to the future of AI or something like that. There's a general intelligence or something along those lines, but probably would you say there's no way of actually creating something like that?
Well, our big challenge is we don't even know what intelligence is.
Well, that's the other part. We don't even understand the human mind. So how are we going to recreate it? And and we don't understand intelligence has been, that has been a long, like a long issue that has caused a lot of problems when we thought we understood what intelligence actually means. And actually, just even the way we looked at autistic people as, what their limitations were. People that are on the spectrum, we miscategorize them into groups, so that this misunderstanding and thinking that we could just apply statistics and algorithms to understanding what people's intelligence are actually is highly problematic. And and actually intelligence is a perfect area for that. When there's an area and I was just thinking about how statistical, the inability to recreate some of these studies a lot of times is the result of not understanding nature to begin with.
Exactly.
It's interesting to see how this kind of comes together. I'm glad I came in when I did.
It's all related. And this is what's hard for us, is that as moderns, we're taught that the universe is a machine made up of parts, and we're machines made up of parts. Our brain is a machine made up of parts. Everything is parts. And the idea that these things are more closely related than that they're related the way that organic things are related, where they grow out of each other and they are part of each other and depend upon each other, it creates a level of complexity that doesn't lend itself to analysis using our sort of simple-minded slice and dice approaches to figuring things out. And so we're sort of antagonistic to it. You can see our mania, our lust for simplicity, in the fact that most people still believe that IQ is a thing, that you could reduce this to a single 2 or 3 digit number, and that really says all you need to know about how smart somebody is. Look at the grammar of it. How smart, that's like how tall, or how much water do I have in this cup? The idea of an IQ of 98 being worse than an IQ of 147 because 147 has more I in it is like the level of oversimplification of what intelligence is, the crudeness of it, little children can manage a more complex understanding of intelligence than what an IQ test presupposes. It doesn't take much to get someone to start thinking about the complexities of the way we see the world. A child can do it. But here we have all over the world, all these people who are very concerned about their IQ value or somebody else's IQ value, as though that could possibly be a meaningful value. It's because it may be stupid, but it's a number, and we love numbers. We love them because you can add them, you can subtract them, you can do statistics on them. They lend themselves to our systems, our noetic rationalizing systems of analysis. And for that reason, we don't even care if they're completely false. They're just so handy that we're willing to overlook the fact that, IQs were developed by eugenicists and proto-Nazis, and the motivation behind them is really quite horrible, as well as stupid. But we suppress all that because it pleases us. It's a placida. So they please us. They please our Noetic, ultra-Apollonian, modernist way of seeing the world. So order and chaos. Let's go back to that. So I spent a bunch of time just sketching out what order and chaos look like to a modern. But let's talk about what they look like to a Greek, or more importantly, to nature itself. You know, you look at the way a forest grows from a savanna along a system of rivers, and nobody passed a law telling it had to do that. No one sent in a police officer with a club and a gun forcing it to do that, or an army. There was no blueprint. There was no diagram. There was no great plan that said, in the end, the forest will look like X. And if there were, the one thing we can say from our experience going back to forests over time is, well, we either haven't hit that moment of the blueprint, or we passed it and left it long ago, because forests are constantly changing. Where the trees are falling down, new trees are growing in different directions or suppressing themselves. It's like it, to a modern, obsessed with whether you're following the prescribed plan, it looks like chaos because it won't follow the plan. But it does a better job of organizing a complex living system than any plan that a human being has ever put together. Our plans are ridiculously childish, simplistic things compared to the levels of adaptation and nuance that end up developing over the course of centuries in a forest that grows of its own accord along a river system. And to us, that's inexplicable. That simply can't be happening. Now, it makes a certain amount of sense in the US in particular, because we came here, it was full of natural resources, which had been developed for thousands of years by the indigenous people, but we'll pretend it's wilderness and that God gave it to us, which is what the people were all saying when they got here. This is all ours and God gave it to us, and screw the poor unfortunates who can't fight back to stop us. Well, the thing is, we encountered a continent full of life, full of forests, full of fish, full of birds, full of herds of bison. We didn't have to ask ourselves, where did this all come from? Our only question was, how are we going to use it to get rich? Right? We're going to, become lumber barons, or we're going to become coal barons, or, we're going to, if we could corner the market on X, we're going to become fabulously wealthy, and we'll create order out of this chaos that just happens to be, we lucked out and got a bounty. We're treating the order that was there as either a fortuitous accident or God's will, which, since God is ineffable and inexplicable, is nevertheless a fortuitous accident from our perspective, right? We didn't make that order. We didn't have to. What's unthinkable to us is that only 2,000 years ago, the Amazon was not a rainforest. It was a grassland, a system of rivers with a few trees here and there. And that the indigenous people decided to cultivate a food forest, would have ultimately became the world's largest food forest. And they did it generation after generation after generation, just giving back to the soil, making sure that seeds sprouted more often than they would have, and so on. They sort of engaged with it in an iterative, incremental way, mimicking what they saw from successful ecosystems elsewhere, in which, rather than having a plan, you just look at how it is right now, you see what the immediate opportunities are, and you incrementally move forward in those areas and then see what happens. You spend a lot of time listening and watching and thinking, and then making little changes over time. And if you do that, you mimic nature's own chaos from a modernist perspective, which is actually order. It's organic order. How is it that a commune of amoebas, a slime mold, can solve a maze without a single neuron, without a brain, without ever thinking, without a plan, without a design? It's because you don't need one. What you need is sensing the environment, and based on that, making little incremental changes, and then stopping and sensing again. The more you use gnosis, immersion in the experience and attentiveness to the experience, the less you use noesis, the big planner, the big designer, the schemer, the systematizer. The less you do that, and the more you just pay attention and then make little changes, the more successful you are with organic order. So successful that you can solve a maze without a brain. And that's how forests grow on their own. And that's what the indigenous people of the Amazon mimicked in their approach to organic order, which we call chaos. And the result of their approach to organic order was they generated the world's largest food forest. It looks like a natural phenomenon so successfully that we didn't even know until recently that that's where it came from, because they imitated the way that nature organizes things. And because nature organizes things that way, it's able to create massive scales of order. About 2,000 years, Stephen. That's what the current estimates are. About 2,000 years ago, it was a grassland. So there is this weird contradiction that we have, where the thing that we call chaos is a mix of some things that might really be chaos alongside what are the most potent forms of order we know about in the cosmos, which we deny can possibly be order because we don't like the kind of order that it is. We say things should not be ordered that way. That is not Apollonian, it's not Noetic, and we don't like it. So we would like to rule all that out. Nobody should do that. They should all do things the way we like to do it, even if that leads to failure. I look at the space shuttle and the way that the relationship between NASA and the contractors was organized in such a way that they could get a defective O-ring into a crucial location such that it caused the explosion of the Challenger. And I think about, even when that's not happening, every single time you flew a space shuttle, by the time it landed, it had lost so many heat shields that had fallen off the tiles, and so many bolts have been loosened and so on, that it was many, many months of difficult work to put it back together again to the point where it could fly again. That was among the most magnificent human accomplishments, using noetic, systematic, linear, left-brain, Apollonian order. It was a masterpiece of that, and still it fell apart every time we used it. By contrast, the Amazon rainforest, created by these indigenous people using organic forms of order, is so successful that even now, when we're mowing down a football field every hour, I can't remember what the pace is, but the rate of deforestation down there under the current government is just unbelievable. Nevertheless, if they let up for even a moment anywhere, they forget to keep mowing it down, it starts growing back. It is not a machine. It is not an entropic structure. Yeah, 2,000 years old. It is an organic structure that, like we see in living organisms, it recreates itself. And so all you have to do to heal the damage that we've done to the Amazon rainforest, the unbelievable levels of damage we've done, all you have to do to heal it is leave it alone. You leave it alone, it will grow back. It's that successful. But a space shuttle will not grow back because it follows mechanical order, the kind that we like. You see what I mean? What we call chaos is a confusion between some things that are chaos and some things that are the best forms of order. And what we call order is a kind of order that creates brittle mechanical systems that naturally fall apart. And this is the challenge. So when we're talking about othering and aliosis and becoming, from the perspective of noetic order, that's horrifying because we might be violating our plan. We didn't want to get wrinkles. We didn't want to get gray hair. We didn't want to get back pain. None of this was part of our plan, and we hate it. The noetic side of us, the egotistical side, hates aging. But the gnosic side recognizes that the life cycle is what makes life possible. We get to be alive because we have this arc of development. And the arc of development necessarily includes these things that aren't part of our plan. We don't even need a plan. We didn't come about from a plan. I mean, some people were planned children. My parents, really, I was an accident, to be fair. and but even the people who plan their children don't plan them in a noetic way, in the sense of they lay out where all of the cells are going to go. And this one's going to be left-handed, and that child's going to be right-handed, and this child's going to be an artist. The parents who try to parent that way, it never works, right? Your children are going to become whoever it is in their nature to become, and the best thing that you can do is sort of shepherd them along and help them. But for us, that is a very tough pill to swallow because it's a struggle between noesis and gnosis. And we really, really, really want to apply our noesis. We really want to. And we don't even know why we're so addicted to just trying to make the pretty rose. And, there's this garden at Versailles, beautiful garden, geometrically laid out, circles and lines and triangles, where they're going to plant things. The topiaries are all carefully made into different shapes. It is a triumph of noesis. An army of gardeners works it over and over and over and over to keep it looking the way that it was designed. Because left to its own devices, it wants to grow into something else. It is a relentless struggle to suppress the organic order of that garden and keep it imposed as a rigid mechanical order, because the realm of nature is the realm of aliosis. And the fact that no one ever said, you know what, I think Louis was an idiot. He was a modern, he was obsessed with order, and let's let that go. And let's instead think about what sort of a garden design, and design I have to use loosely here, it could grow into or might want to grow into on its own, that might be at least as beautiful, maybe more beautiful, but that wouldn't require an army of gardeners to stop it from doing what it's trying to do. You know what I mean? There's this way in which we set ourselves up in order to impose order by fighting the order that's trying to emerge. And in some ways, that is the most important definition of the modern epoch. Whether it comes to how we treat people, natural resources, what have you, we are in an endless war against the order that's trying to emerge, because we think that if we don't do that, there's no order at all. We think it's chaos. Phil, and then Stephen, and then some more text. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, it seems this leads me to a question about, and it really goes back to the Greeks, about the Oedipus Trilogy. I'm curious about two things. Of course, he wrote the third play, Oedipus at Cologne, when he was 90 years old.
Right.
Okay. First of all, how did he manage to transcend the Greek way of thinking and write that play? Or maybe he didn't transcend it, or maybe that's just because we have venerated the other two plays more, and this is sort of sunk to the background. Because it seems to me like if human beings are at the bottom of the ladder, in a sense, and we have to struggle to know the world of nature and the gods, then you really are like limited, and you live in some sense a tragic existence. And so that's eminent. So therefore, in a sense, the Greeks couldn't, well, they wrote comedies, but they were not the kind of comedies, they were more like the funny kind of comedies, but not the comedies as we think of, everything turn out well. So then there's really this thing about, I guess, a struggle between tragedy and nobility, because even with Oedipus Rex and Antigone, even though they were tragic figures, they were noble figures, right? And so it seems to me nobility is held in very high esteem.
Mm-hmm.
How did Sophocles manage to write this play that, in a sense, doesn't fit in the categories? I mean, I guess you could call it part of the, trilogy of tragedies. But when I read it, it was not tragic. It was like, so could you explain how he was able to make that transition and actually, in a sense, begin to arrive at a kind of wisdom? And to what degree that prejudice about venerating that as the paramount play that he wrote became sort of like semi-forgotten, even though it wasn't forgotten. And the other two, which were more paradigmatic of the Greeks, became highlighted as very, very important plays. So that seemed to be circling around what you've been talking about in terms of how we know the world.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it comes down to, you know, what did the medievals recognize and value in the ancient literature? If they didn't, the less they recognized it or valued it, the less it survived. One of the, I guess it was my 1985, 1986 world history course at University of Washington that opened my eyes the most to the structure of medieval civilization. If you didn't know anything else about medieval civilization, the most important thing to know about it, said Professor Bridgman, was that it was decentralized. Rome may have called the shots about the theology, but there's a reason why they assigned bishops all over the place and lay clergy, and why there were monasteries everywhere, and why every monastery was copying all the works. Because Europe was being slammed from the east over and over and over by nomadic invaders. And at some point it started to be, you know, attacked from the south and the southwest and the southeast as well by Islam. And then from the north by the Vikings. It was being hammered from every direction. If there had been a single point of vulnerability, it would have fallen. That would have been the end. It had to be so redundant, yet like a BlackBerry, the only way to root the thing out of your yard was to get every last scrap of it. Because if you left anything, it would grow back. He said, that's the most important thing to know about the structure of medieval society. All those other terms, feudalism, manorialism, church and state, all those other things, those are just details. The important thing is this relentless copying of works everywhere, all the time, creating backup after backup after backup after backup, so that it could start over again if it had to. Because, in fact, it had to, right? The Mongols came halfway through Europe, all the way halfway through Europe. And at the point where they stopped, they'd won. They would have taken out the rest too. If it weren't for a timely funeral that they all went home for and then decided not to come back and finish the conquest, we'd all be speaking Mongolian. The Vikings went through every river system in Europe, all of them, right? They got into France, they got into Spain, they got into Germany, they founded Russia, they got everywhere. And yet we didn't all become Vikings and, you know, Northmen speaking their language and worshiping their religion, because they didn't get it all. And when they had to coexist side by side, eventually the system grew back, right, from the roots that hadn't been killed. And it was the same when Islam. Islam comes from Gibraltar and crosses over into Spain, makes it to the Pyrenees. And it doesn't make it any further, but I mean, that's a chunk of Europe right there that's taken out and is converted to Islam. Likewise, you know, they cross over the Bosporus and take Constantinople. The Turks take Constantinople. And still there's Europe. So everything we know from a great deal of what we know about the ancients and what they knew is dependent upon this relentless copying. And the question is, what did they want to copy? Our understanding of the ancient Greeks is really, really limited and heavily filtered by medieval value systems. And the medievals didn't need to actually understand the full significance of what they were copying. They just needed to see something in it that they thought was in there and was important, whether it was or not. So they look at Oedipus and they see sin, right? How is Oedipus taught to moderns? He was a great sinner. He did these terrible things. The Oedipus complex is this sin. The Electra complex is this sin that Freud captures in his schema. We remember them for their sins. We are really not ready to hear what we've talked about in this series of seminars, that there is a deeper point to Oedipus. That is that people who think like moderns are not fit to govern, which is the core point. We are singularly unfit to be able to recognize in the play because it goes against our deepest belief systems. But the medievals didn't appreciate it either. They didn't know that's what Oedipus was about. They didn't know that's what they were preserving. They were trying to preserve a story about sin. And they preserved Oedipus at Colonna because it was the third part of the trilogy that they'd already decided to preserve, right? It's the caboose that comes with the engine and the main car. But you can be sure they didn't really understand what they were copying any more than moderns understand it. It's a very, for most readers, most modern readers, but I think for medieval readers as well, Oedipus at Colonna is a very confusing play. It's hard to figure out what it's about. You know, Oedipus has this strange liminal quality in it, standing on the threshold between life and death. And the way that everybody relates to him, you can read it on the surface as just some people doing some things and it's just a plot and then it's over. But at a deeper level, it has to do with the Greek conception of death and veneration and what is holy and what is, you know, unworldly and miasma and taboo versus what is sacred and must be preserved. And the idea that this play is about the transformation of what is taboo into what is holy while the person is still alive and engaged in the process of transformation it's not something any of us would really grasp. But when you feel the full scope of these plays, as you've pointed out on numerous times, Phil, you can see how this third play really gives meaning, new meaning, deeper meaning to the first two plays. They take on new significance because of how it all ends. Oedipus Tyrannus by itself is, whatever its impact may be, it can only be a third appreciated on its own. It's not until you see the follow-ups that you see what was fully at stake, what was set in motion, and what it all means. So I feel like probably for Sophocles, even though he waited a long time to write the third part, until he himself had become liminal and could write from the perspective of Oedipus, until he felt like he could do it justice. Nevertheless, I feel like he must have had the whole thing in mind when he first sat down to write the trilogy, because they all, I mean, not as a design, but as a story arc, he must have had a sense of the adding layers of profundity with each additional play. It's just to us, I think, afterwards, trying to piece it together from our modernist perspective, that it feels out of place. Anyway, that's my guess. I do love that trilogy. I mean, it's really quite profound. Stephen, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I question strongly that assertion an intelligence test doesn't mean much. This is the thing Jordan Peterson said, the great God, one of the great ones we must worship in the modern age. And that's the point he said of the metaphysical understandings, because we have understandings in physics and we have metaphysical understandings, the world of the still somewhat unknown, that the IQ test is one of the greatest metaphysical determinants there is. And I would say he's pretty much correct. When it comes to understanding abstract knowledge, the IQ test will work pretty well. Now, I'm not saying that it's everything. It's not, but it is very important in the modern world. That's the misfortune. If it was a case where we were living in that small West Virginian town that was in deliverance, having an IQ was probably a detriment. But there you have the joke. The sophisticates come into the small town, but they don't understand it.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I really think that there's a few sweeping statements being made there. There's a lot of sweeping statements
You're right.
there which are pursuing a politics which says we must be all equal.
Which
And
I don't
say,
believe. Which I don't believe.
Yeah. You know, my point is the world is a slaughterhouse. Ultimately, history is a slaughterhouse. And it's in the humble sperm. That was a point Monty Python made, that not all sperms are equal. Well, they implied that out of all those billions of sperms, there's only they all want to meet an egg, but only one in a few billion will meet one, or something like that.
Right.
And my reaction is not anger.
Right.
My reaction is fear. When I realize just how big and just how dangerous the universe is.
Yes.
But there's a perspective at the moment which I think is naive.
Yeah.
That the world of nature can be made amorphitized. Yeah, I think there's some sweeping statements. That other one, that the Amazon is only 2,000 years old. Yeah, that seems to be a sort of, thing that's come in the last few years, a sort of popular ideology. But there are sweeping statements being made there that are subject to caution.
Yeah. Yeah. But so let's correct them both. Let's correct them both. Yeah, you're right, Stephen.
Hang on. Don't be too quick to become the orthodoxy, please.
Carry on.
But, yeah, that's my point, Rick. Beware of trying to being the new orthodoxy.
Yeah, no one should listen to me.
No, that's not the thing. The thing is, nobody can disagree with this view.
So let's disagree with it right now. Let's fix it. Because I can go with you and agree on both of these. So it's not that an IQ test measures nothing the way I implied earlier. It's not a bad test of noesis. How developed is your noesis in your noetic education? The thing it's terrible at is gnosis, because we're sort of blind to the existence of gnosis, which is part of why our attempts at artificial intelligence are so bad. We're trying to make a purely noetic intelligence, and we don't understand what's missing. We don't know that noesis is dependent upon gnosis. So we can't figure out why our attempts at pure noesis are far less successful than even the most extremely noetic person who lives, because even the most noetic person who lives started in gnosis. So it shouldn't be called an IQ test. It should be called a noesis test, perhaps. And what we don't have is a gnosis test. We don't know how to do that. There were some interesting experiments run trying to make alternative IQ tests that measured more gnosic faculties. And not surprisingly, they found, first of all, they couldn't make a single abstract one because abstraction is the realm of noesis. They had to make specific ones for different contexts, because gnosis is about immersion in an environment and coming to understand it as an experience. They made one for the Australian outback, at which Australian Aborigines did extraordinarily well at, but people of European descent who hadn't spent much time in the outback couldn't do it all. And it had to do with recognizing where you are. Can you distinguish rocks from each other? Can you distinguish trees from each other? Do you know a landscape? And even people who had incredibly high IQs flunked this one, unless they had also been people who grew up in the outback and were used to noting the fine distinctions between these things that come naturally to people who are in that environment. Similar experiments have been made with different inhabited places. So it's part of the challenge is that we can give you one number maybe for noesis, but we can't give you one number for gnosis, because all these different experiential places are different. This goes to Hegel's point that begriff is more concrete and tangible. It deals with things more like how they actually are, and it's more experiential, but the downside is that it's more parochial, right? What is the actual experience you've lived in this place doesn't really prepare you for broad sweeping generalizations. Noesis gets this broad generalizing power, which means you could write a universal test for noesis, but it comes at the price of being devoid of concrete detail. You end up having to become a master of abstract math, abstract logic, abstract shapes, and so forth. So you're right. I oversimplified it earlier. It's not useless. It's just, it has a very specific use, the IQ test. And you're also right that this isn't the first Amazon rainforest that has been there. The location of the Amazon rainforest is a location that whenever the climate's right, it wants to grow a rainforest. What the indigenous people were doing was at the right time and in the right place to generate a rainforest. If they tried to do it at a different time or a different place, it might not have worked, because each place and each climate has its own telos. It has its own seeds of future selves that it's capable of becoming. And if you work with them, you get amazing results. But if you work against them and try to just work your noetic will in a roundabout way that emulates gnosis, you're going to fail. You're not going to get the Antarctic under current climatic conditions to grow rainforest, despite the fact that long ago there was a rainforest there. We've got fossils, we've got evidence. So what you're citing here, in the Wikipedia article, reflects the fact that there have been Amazon rainforests in that same place before. It's just this one that we know where it came from, and the others developed presumably by themselves. And I guess on the question of orthodoxy, yeah, everything that I say should be taken with a whole truckload of salt, because I'm a modern and I'm immortal, and what the hell do I know? I'm just exploring this stuff to help us play with it. That's all. No orthodoxy. So going back to Kenneth Smith's text, after talking about aliasis or othering, he says, all of natural existence is thus in motion, on the way from one state into another. Nothing is actually still, it just looks that way. He has a quote that says, things are at rest by changing. The way that things achieve a state of restfulness is by changing. And that reflects the way that a stable blood sugar is not a status quo. It's something your body fights for by measuring the blood sugar levels and then responding with hormones to raise or lower it or make other kinds of adjustments, relentlessly, constantly sampling and adjusting, just like the slime mold samples and adjusts to spread out into the maze or to search its environment in the natural world under the leaves in a forest. That it is that symathesis, constant sampling and an adjustment that generates intelligent results and produces what can look like a status quo. Part of, when I was growing up, when I was young and first getting into biology, they emphasized biostasis a great deal, talking about how is it that biological systems in a rapidly changing world with temperatures going up and down and so forth manage to keep, like, your body temperature relatively stable within a pretty narrow range. And that was what prepared me for Heraclitus, because I already had this notion that your body does an enormous amount of work to make things hold still. It's by changing that they achieve a state of rest, is Heraclitus's point. So then he says, Heraclitus's incisive dictum, Panta Re, all things flow, captures for all time the quintessence of ancient dynamism. The world, and parenthetically, he doesn't say but implies, not as status quo, but as fluxus quo. The normal state of things is transformation. Panta Re, we don't have any of Heraclitus's original text, not a single scrap. Everything is from quotations from others. Panta Re is a quotation from Plato. And I forget, maybe Donald can remember, I forget which dialogue it is, in which he has an extensive discussion of Heracliteanism. But it's Plato who sums up Heraclitus's entire philosophy in those two words: Panta, everything, and Re, it's flowing, all things flow. And the kind of reflexive, instinctive modernist repulsion that we feel towards the notion of a chaotic world, i.e. a changing world, can cause us to mentally oversimplify what Heraclitus is talking about. He's not just saying it's good that things change, or else he'd be saying any change is good, which he's not, right? He is a strong proponent of agon, of the struggle for aristeia. He talks relentlessly about the need to do better and to struggle for it and to work for it. And he also talks a lot about this notion that what looks to us like a status quo, because it's the result of a lot of work, is always a construct of a dynamic system in which opposing forces are harnessed together, so that when you pull too far in one direction, the other force pulls you back. These harnessed systems, like the lyre or the bow, where the force is bent back upon itself, he sees as the basic pattern of the deep logos of the cosmos. Everything that generates order in nature at some deeper level is all made up of these dynamic systems of forces that are not just in opposition, but are tied together, harnessed together, working together against each other in order to keep a living biome within which stasis is possible, right? You don't have to move a human being's temperature too far down or too far up before they die. You don't have to move their blood sugar too far up or too far down before they die. You don't have to move their blood pressure too far up or too far down before they die. The same is true for countless metrics. Medicine, it's why medicine has a whole section of its discipline that's about measuring vitals. Because if you can figure out where the vitals are, you get some clues, really important clues about what's wrong, and more importantly, about what systems are not doing their job, because they're supposed to be doing that work of keeping, in a world of change, harnessing change and using it against itself to create a stable oscillation within a safe zone. A really surprisingly, I mean, anybody who works in medicine will tell you, a really surprisingly narrow safe zone within which life is possible for each organism, for each individual. In countless different ways, there are many things they have to control, but they control them not according to a script, not according to a plan or a design, but according to symathesis, by feeling it, by constantly measuring, by constantly sensing, by not being overly preoccupied with their own plans and ideas, but by constantly paying attention and adjusting, right? Part of the hazard of a late stage civilization or epoch is that it becomes inwardly focused. Because its own success makes it feel like it's the sum total of everything. It stops looking outward for challenges. It starts looking inward for refining itself and perfecting itself. And, enemies, foreign and domestic, that phrase you hear among law enforcement all the time and in the FBI, this shows the preoccupation with purging, with purifying. We got to get rid of the dissident elements in order to protect what we've achieved. But what's hiding within that is two things. One is the complacency with what one has achieved, which we talked about earlier with the medievals. What is the challenge of a medieval when they reach the high Middle Ages? It's that their victory is leading to defeat, right? They're no longer stretching. And the other is, as part and parcel of that, is they're giving up their symathesis relationship with the world. They're not smelling and tasting and watching and sensing and constantly attending to what's going on. They've given that up and they're looking inwards and saying, oh yeah, well, what's Bob doing? What's so-and-so doing? And assessing their own internal culture more than they're assessing their relationship to the larger picture. And because they're not paying as much attention to the larger picture, that becomes less and less harmonious. And as a result, the shockwaves of turbulence between the directions that they're going and the directions the world is going begin to get larger and larger until eventually it builds up a large enough wave to swamp it. And that's the end of that civilization. And it has to grow into a new one and change. So there is all of these things that we're talking about here. You can see why Hegel is taking these Heraclitean dialectical ideas and applying them to the structure of history itself. Because there's a direct relationship between the systems that allow us to maintain our blood sugar and the systems that allow a culture to grow and to thrive in the world. Okay, so we're down to our last half hour. I don't think it'll take that long to get through the rest of this. We might be able to do it. So the next paragraph where he talks about, as Nietzsche grasped, the premier accomplishment of human culture lay in achieving stability, predictability, and self-regularity. We talked about that last week, so I'm just going to skip that paragraph for now. But you can see how it follows directly on what we talked about, that the culture internally needs to have the same kind of harnessed dynamic forces that allow it to stay alive in the same way an organism stays alive. That Nietzsche quote about the animal that dared to promise as being core to what Homo sapiens is, that we get enough control over ourselves that we begin to believe we can predict the future, including of our own behavior, and therefore make a promise, is a curious thing. But let's go forward. So earlier, somebody, maybe it was Donald, was quoting this next paragraph where it was Phil. The unthinkable, right? In nature, as the order of generated and evolutionary being, two concepts are in principle ruled out as unthinkable. One, that anything could simply spontaneously erupt into being without precedent or precondition. For all that is natural had to grow into being out of seeds of potentiality. And that's what we said, everything contains the seeds of its future self, as well as the seeds of its offspring. For ex nihilo nihil fit, out of nothing, nothing can be produced. This is the first of the two unthinkable concepts to an ancient. And for an ancient, the idea of a divinity that exists outside of nature in a realm without time or space or nature, that through an act of fiat will creates nature out of nothing, as described in Genesis, to the Greeks makes no sense at all. It is absurd. It's an inexpressible idea, because that's not how nature works, ever. And for them, that's also not how the divine works, ever. The divine is the sacred parts of nature that we must attend to and respect, of nature, not the sacred parts outside of nature. The idea of the supernatural is a non-starter for the Greeks. And that was the wedge that the early Christians hammered into the ancient world to begin their program of rising to power. Not the earliest Christians, the ones who were concerned with brotherhood and taking care of each other and all that stuff. The later Christians, the Orthodox Christians who wanted to make an empire, this is how they had to go at the ancient world. They hammered right on this seam right here. The second point that, oh, and by the way, you can see right after today's discussion, you can see why that's an unthinkable thought for the ancient Greeks, right? That something could come from nothing, that there is no debt of causality to the past, that something could just erupt into being out of nowhere, right? Because in nature, they see everything as containing not just the seeds of the future, but the consequences of the past. The logical corollary is that we are in debt to what came before. We are part of a larger story. We're always in the middle of the story. We're never at the beginning of the story. This is why Heraclitus says the cosmos always has been and always shall be. It says because we are always in media res, we're always in the middle, always. And therefore, there can't be an origin story. Anything that we think of as an origin story must be incomplete. You know, the modern Marvel Cinematic Universe films love to tell origin stories. They like, when they introduce a new hero, they love to do, here's a movie about how that hero came into existence. First, he was not a hero, and then this event happened, and now he's a hero. And then the rest of the arc goes from there. They like to establish beginnings in the same way that Genesis establishes a beginning. They want to nail down a point at the beginning and start drawing the line from there. But for the Greeks, that was an alien concept. Sure, you nail down a point, but it's in the middle. And as the story goes forward, it also goes backward as we learn more about how we got here. And as we learn how we got here, it causes us to reinterpret where we started from and to understand that we didn't understand it in the first place, that we had a bunch of assumptions about how we got there, and they're all being overturned as we learn the rest of the story, until finally they become the whole shape of the arc of the story. The story that grows from the middle to both ends is the Greek model. And so an origin story doesn't actually really make sense. A lot of the things we think of as origin stories for the Greek gods and the Greek heroes were written later by later mythologists who were backfilling the origins for their favorite gods and heroes. Hesiod, his Theogony, for example, which describes, where all the gods came from. That was late. Greek religion had been around for over 1,000 years by the time he got around to writing that thing. The beginning wasn't a place you started. It was a place you struggled back to try to understand. The other thing is the idea that anything could be in an absolute or abstracted way, that anything could be in an absolute or abstracted way, that it could have perfect identity, imperturbable self-sameness, and impregnability against corruption. That was also unthinkable to them. So you can see this in the difference between the medieval conception of the human soul and the Greek conception of the human soul. In the Greek conception of the human soul, oh yeah, you've got a soul, but it is constantly changing because, like everything in nature, it's becoming. It has developed from past selves and past influences, and it contains the seeds of the future, a teleology that's causing it to develop into something new. It is an organism within us, just like everything is an organism. The organism undergoing its development and its life cycle is the fundamental model for literally everything for an ancient Greek. Even a number. Anything that you can think of as static. Just stretch your mind, which is easy to do for a modern. What are the most static things you can imagine? And now put yourself in the position of the Greeks and think about how would you reinterpret what to us seems to be static as something that is actually an organism that's transforming over time. And one way you could do it is you could say, well, 7, the number 7, is not an eternal thing by itself, but is part of a continuum that grew out of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and is growing into 8, 9, 10, 11, that it's part of a system of transformations, right? When you read Euclid or Pythagoras or other writers, this is how they talk about math. When they talk about the square of a number, they didn't choose the word square because they needed a word and that's as good as any other word. They literally meant when laying down tiles on the floor in a square, how many tiles are you laying down? The square of a number is what happens when you take a row of tiles and then you expand it out to make a square. Our concept of powers, which we think of as an abstraction that is, from on high, from the laws of mathematics, they think of as if this is something we discovered in the world as part of a story. And it is every concept in math is part of a larger process of mutation and transformation and is an organism and not an abstraction. To us, it seems radical because to us, it's natural to have a bunch of ideas in abstracto that are separate from the changing world, that we think of as more perfect, more reliable, more logical, more rational, and that those should be the meter, the measuring stick against which we measure the cosmos. But to the Greeks, there is not this separation into two realms. All of those things that we think of as pure, perfect, unchanging, imperturbable metrics, they think of as properties discovered within a changing world, and that they themselves, rather than measuring a stasis, they measure transformation and are themselves part of a larger transformation. Nothing to them can possibly exist in an imperturbable, perfect perpetual form. That whole concept is meaningless to them. But that's what we base almost everything on when it comes to our systems of organization. Phil and then Joseph. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I wonder whether that isn't a limitation in this sense. I mean, I kind of agree with it, but I wonder whether that's not a limitation of our limits. Because, like, while I believe what that says, it does seem to limit the horizon, both forwards and backwards, right? The horizon only is real in the sense to the degree that we could trace it back, and beyond that, it really becomes myth. That's not a bad word, but it becomes this sort of thing that you make up. And the horizon to the future, in some ways, is even more limited because you don't know the destiny except within an experiential thing that you could, I guess, validate. And so is it that the medievals, in some sense, and I don't want to put it on one side or the other, made the mistake of extending the horizon too far into the past and too far into the future, and the moderns make the mistake of extending the horizon too far into the future, and then and therefore, in some sense, do not pay enough attention to the immediacy of the present. And I don't mean present like just what happened today, but I mean present in the span of our understanding our own lives, so that it extends. So in one sense, even though this does say that human beings are at the bottom of the ladder, in some ways, human being is the one that makes the understanding of understanding that is appropriate. So in some sense, it's kind of on the top because it constructs this arc of possibilities within its own experience. So there's a funny kind of loop around.
Yeah, that's Hegel's argument. That's right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's been much remarked upon that the medievalist conception of history broke with the ancient conception of history two different ways. It said the world hasn't always been here. It has a beginning point, and it's described in Genesis. And the world isn't going to continue forever. It has an end point, and that's described in Revelations. And that those 2 points are absolute walls that God has erected. There was nothing before the first wall, and there will be nothing in this world after the second wall. History went from being infinite and having profound depths of time to being finite and becoming a drama with a very specific single story that we're all part of, and that we all have certain duties and rights and obligations within. And that was the reason for setting those 2 pillars at the beginning and end of history in the medieval conception of time. It is by being sort of that double refutation of the infinities of the Greek conception of time, it is a double revolution. They overthrow both ends of the scale of time, if you will. It would be difficult to conceive of a more complete rejection of the ancient conception of time, from which, I mean, you can infer that the Christians, the pre-medieval Christians who were struggling against ancient orthodoxy, were really angry with ancient orthodoxy. And anyone who lived through late stage Rome with its intense corruption could easily understand that. It was a mess. They had a lot of reason to be angry. So they didn't fiddle around and say, if we make a few small changes, this is going to work just great. They said, everything you think is wrong on every level. You're wrong about nature. You're wrong about God. You're wrong about man. You're wrong about time. You're wrong about meaning. If it's important, you're wrong about it. And we're going to show you why in detail at a level that nobody could misunderstand our intentions. It's, even though you can't draw a simple line and say that before this is classical and after this is medieval, once you look at what they stand for, there's no mistaking the two for each other, because the medieval is a complete inversion of the ancient and its value system. It's fairly complete. Donald, go ahead.
Yeah. While we have the Greeks having this flow view of nature and a understanding of the interconnectedness of all living things, I don't think we can modernize, and you haven't done this, modernize them as sort of Darwinian or
Right.
evolutionary.
Not at all.
They don't see how the current living forms have come into existence. They see that they existed, and we're in the middle of that. And I don't think they see how the form of a tree changes in its becoming, but I don't think they have some grasp that we get new trees or new species or new forms. So in that sense, well, it's sort of medieval, you know.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a finite number of these they're not unchanging. Their essence doesn't change.
Right.
But their lifespan is a life of constant change. Well, I think I garbled that enough, but I didn't, you know, they're not moderns.
They're not moderns.
They're not moderns.
No, that's right. You know, it's the longer that you spend wrestling with these Smithian ideas that these different epochs have radically different worldviews. Yes, they're all derived from basic human faculties. Yes, we're all Homo sapiens. Yes. But that doesn't change the fact that Homo sapiens has an enormous variety of potential expressions. That is what we do. That's who we are as a species. That's our stupid pet trick. Can't fly, can't breathe water, can't do all kinds of things, but we have an enormous variety of behavior. But the modernist dogma is that at all times, we all have equal access to the full range of behavior. Anybody could be anything. I could become a musician, or I could be a politician, or I could be a pilot, or I could be a stonemason. I could always change my mind to be something else. The Greeks and Kierkegaard and Hegel and Smith say, no, that's not true. Because for that to be true, we would have to have no inner nature. We would have to be a vacuum of lawfulness internally, and therefore not have any bindings upon us that prevented us from going in some directions or pushed us to go in other directions. The modern dogma is that we are infinitely free. Now, in the 70s and 80s and 90s and noughties and teenies, we're starting to see that that's not true. We're starting to understand generational cycles of alcoholism, generational cycles of mental illness and abuse. We're starting to see that we don't come out of the gate free. We come out of the gate with character constraints upon us. Some of them might be genetic, but we recognize that some of it is family culture. And that idea is a counter-modern idea. That's how you know we're in late-stage modernism. This is a counter-modern idea. The most modernist perfect idea is the 50s and 60s and Skinner and the radical behaviorists who surpassed Skinner after him, who said that we're a tabula rasa and we could do anything and be anything. But by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, people are writing books where they're saying, we appear not to be at the beginning with a blank slate that could become anything. We appear to be in the middle with a bunch of stuff already set in motion before we start thinking. And that part of our job in life is to figure out what have we inherited. And based on that, to understand that some things are going to be more in reach for us and other things are going to be farther out of reach for us, and that we should choose our life path accordingly. I have never drunk alcohol as an adult because I come from a long family history of alcoholism. Every adult member of my family on both sides for generations their lives were heavily shaped by alcoholism. And that, as dim as I am, that was enough for me to clue in that I probably should never take my first drink if I didn't want to spend the rest of my life drinking, because it's just the way I'm written, right? That's an experiment I don't need to run. I married a woman who could drink as much alcohol as she likes, and she doesn't particularly care. Every so often she has a glass of wine, and that's about it. It has no rulership over her because it's not in her family history, but there's no doubt that it's in mine, and I am not infinitely free. For every person, we are gradually coming to understand that It may not be alcohol. It may be something else. But we have an inner character that we have inherited that predisposes us toward some things and against other things. There is a lawfulness in us that means that, contrary to the promises of the founding fathers, we are not infinitely free. And to be infinitely free, that whole proposition that we're infinitely free is basically pretending that we're God. The Christian God could be infinitely free, or the medieval God. It's not safe to generalize about Christians on this. The medieval God could be infinitely free because he existed before the cosmos. He had no constraints. There was no matter and no lawfulness of the matter to bind him in his choices. You can see it in Genesis. It's right there. But when moderns overthrew God and then pretended that we could do the same thing God could, that we too are infinitely free, right out of the gate, that was incoherent, right? The reason why God was infinitely free, the medieval God was infinitely free in creating the cosmos, makes perfect sense if you know anything about form versus matter and the way that matter constrains the forms that you can apply upon it. Any craftsman learns this basic relationship. And so you remove the constraints of matter, you free up the form, and thus God can be infinitely free. But human beings never existed in abstracto before time and space outside the constraints of matter. We never did. We never even pretended we did. And therefore, we had no basis for arguing that we had the same kind of infinite freedom that the medieval God had. We just simply said it was so. And because we said it was so, we all agreed to believe it. And thus it is moderns, more than any other topic, struggle on this issue of how free are they? How free are they not? What would you have to do to cultivate freedom? We're just really confused about all these things because we think it was our birthright to be born free, whatever that means, which we haven't thought very clearly about. But if we think clearly about it, we can see that it actually doesn't hold water. But you can see why, as an orthodoxy, it perfected itself more and more and more until you get to the behaviorist dream in the mid-20th century that anybody can be turned into anybody else. With the proper education and the proper discipline, the proper motivation, the proper punishments, if you build the perfect system, you can make the perfect person out of anyone because we're all a tabula rasa. This was the perfect dream of modernism. I mean, my friend Linda here says, only if you're a man. Granted, Skinner was a man. Anyone seen Boxing Helena? It's a disturbing film about a Skinnerian experiment on a child to see what happened if you raise them cut off from the world. And it too is a reflection of perfected modernism. But the failures of that model to predict human behavior is what ultimately led to the 70s and 80s and 90s and the recognition that, in fact, we're not God, we're not infinitely free, we're not at the beginning of our story. We are all inheriting a great complex mass of causality and natural law within us, whether we understand it or not. And therefore, our freedom is provisional, and our capacity to become things is provisional. We're going to become something, but what it is isn't entirely under the control of our noesis and our ego and our will and our rationality. Stephen, go ahead.
You've often brought up Kenneth's concept that the medievals, well, the new medievalism saw the corruption of Rome and thought, well, we're going to bring God in as the law over man. And this is an intriguing idea. I'd love to see the minutes of the meeting where they decided it. But however, it's not an absolutely original idea. It does seem to be the basis of the controversy you have in the Old Testament with Samuel and Judges, where the Jews are experimenting with leadership. But the trouble is, every leadership they create goes well for a while and then at the peak and then goes bad.
Yes.
And this seems to be Kenneth's concept here, but we do have a beautiful example of that concept working rather well when St. Ambrose pulls up Theodosius. Theodosius, because what some of his official was killed in the city of Thessalonica, sent in the troops and said, massacre a large part of the population. They literally grabbed people, put them in line and executed them. And it seemed most of the church leaders were afraid to pull up Theodosius, but Ambrose wasn't. He said, no, excommunication for you, Theodosius, until you learn to repent.
Right.
And this is a beautiful example of what Kenneth was trying to say, that everyone was saying, oh, this is fantastic. There's somebody that can pull up the dictates of the emperor before, Ambrose is pointing out there is a law, a moral law above you, Theodosius. So there's your beautiful example.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Stephen. Right on the money. Yeah. And we're not going to finish this chapter today. We've still got 4 paragraphs to go, but the point that you made is so important. I actually just want to use the tail end here to emphasize this. No epoch is itself perfectly, right? Contrary to Parmenides, being is in fact not. It's not the case that how an era defines itself or what its guiding principles are make it be itself in a pure or perfect or absolute way. There is always diversity, just like in human evolution or biological evolution generally. There is always diversity. And although moderns have a myth of evolution that says the infinitely flexible species will be the one that survives and wins, this is the modernist version of evolution. A more accurate version of evolution, which again has come about in the 70s and 80s and 90s, is that that's not the case. Nobody's infinitely flexible. All species are adapted to certain kinds of circumstances, and who thrives under one set of conditions will fail under a different set of conditions. And it's only a matter of time before the world changes, and the thing that you're really, really good at will stop being the conditions that prevail. And the majority, therefore, who's great at that will die off because they're not suited to the new conditions. Evolution isn't so much driven the way that Darwin thought by just a series of little tiny incremental changes that happen to the whole species at a time. Rather, what we've come to understand is know that a species is a bell curve. There's an enormous halo of diversity around the center of the bell curve, of variations on the theme, mutants, variants, people with the wrong skin color, people with the wrong hair color, people who are better or worse at processing oxygen, who think about the world differently, what have you, who can't thrive under the current circumstances, but they're not failure enough to go extinct either. So they accrete around the center of the bell curve in a lower status, a lower level of success. Until the conditions change. And when the conditions change and the middle of the bell curve dies off because they're no longer suited, somewhere in that halo, some freaky oddball who was bad under the previous conditions will turn out to be pretty good under the current conditions. And they will thrive, and they become the center of the new bell curve. And thus the species moves from its center over towards its periphery. And that evolution is actually this, happening over and over time. It's not the center evolving. It's the center diversifying out, and then the center dying out and some part of the periphery growing to replace it. This is how the increments move. Just like the way a glacier flows, a frozen river flows, isn't the way a water that the liquid water in a river flows. In the same way, the way a species flows over time is different from the way we might have thought it flowed. It doesn't walk anywhere. It just does this successive replacement. So the reason that this is important is to understand each of these epochs works the same way. In an epoch, certain species of culture are allowed to thrive because they're compatible with the epoch's core arguments. But it's not a homogeny. You don't have everybody being the same. You have an enormous diversity, a halo surrounding the core cultures of any given epoch. And in that halo are less successful and given the way human beings act under recent centuries, despised side cultures, subcultures that are, that are punished or looked down on or otherwise avoided. But somewhere in that group are the people who, when conditions change, are going to rise to prominence. Because when the conditions change enough that the core group at the center collapses because it's no longer fit, the new conditions, some weird esoteric sect somewhere that everybody scoffed at before is going to be just right for the new situation and rise to prominence. So this is why you can't, the mistake that we fall into is if we start thinking that the ancient epoch of history is a set of dates, then we will think that everybody in those dates shared those beliefs, which is not true. These are organisms. These are species of cultures. There's a diversity. So at the same time that you've got the Greeks and you've got the Romans, in Palestine, you've got the Jews. And the Jews are not Greeks and they're not Romans and they are not ancients. They are living in the ancient epoch, but they are not ancients. They are a different species of cultures because they've already got monotheism and they're already working on theocracies driven by that. And they are a fountain of cultures. If you study the centuries right around zero, just before and after, you'll see Christianity was not the only thing that was generated out of Judaism in Palestine. There were cultures, messianic cultures springing up left and right around that time, an enormous ferment of ideas. And they shared a lot of things in common, but nothing that they shared in common made them Greeks or Romans or really comfortable within the Greek or the Roman model. This is something I don't think I've made very clear before, but this is core to Kenneth Smith's argument as well. Just because, the Samaritans, the Pharisees, the other Hebrews, just because they were living under the Roman Empire or during, Roman times, doesn't mean that they were ancients who fit comfortably within the ancient schema. They were something else. And it was the intersection of that something else with the ancient ethos that created the conflict that ultimately led to the rise of Christianity and the overthrow of the ancient world. The seeds of the future were already present in the ancient world, in a subculture that was in conflict with the larger culture. So that, Stephen, what you said, I felt like I really had to. You're right. You're stressing some important points there, and I felt like I really needed to draw that out. So I guess that wraps us up for this week. Well, I think next week we'll finish and move on to the second set. We've only really got 3.5 paragraphs left to go in A. So I think we'll wrap that up and get into B next week. But I hope that this has helped to underscore, what Kenneth means by the ancient world and why these are not just little details, but are actually principles that help you understand the pattern across the whole range of ancient history. So thanks, everybody. Have a great week.